Chapter 1846. She vaguely felt like she wasn't dreaming. Dreams were usually very messy, but her dream was very organized. She had always been an invisible spectator. It felt like she had traveled back in time 50,000 years after her soul left her body. Everything she saw was very real, but no one in this world could discover her. No matter how powerful someone was, they wouldn't be able to discover her. This was a good thing. She could get close to him infinitely, but unfortunately she couldn't get close. Because she was only a spectator, Ning Xuema as a spectator was much more rational than the person involved. Her eyes greedily looked at Shinjuli. Looking at his handsome side profile, she couldn't bear to look away. In reality, she couldn't see him again. No matter how much she missed him or looked for him, he wouldn't appear again. But in this dream, she could finally see him to her heart's content. Or perhaps he was her poison. She would never get tired of looking at him. The only pity was that she couldn't touch him. She actually wanted to jump into his arms and hug his waist again. But when she jumped over, she would directly pass through his body. She couldn't make any physical contact with him. However, being able to follow him at such a close distance, she could feel a trace of satisfaction. She faintly heard someone calling out to her, but that voice seemed to be separated by thousands of mountains and rivers. She couldn't tell whose voice it was, but she vaguely felt that the voice was asking her to go back, to wake her up. But this dream was so beautiful, and he was so real in the dream. She didn't want to go back, and she didn't want to wake up. She deliberately ignored the call and continued to follow Shinjuli. Seeing her other self interact with the man she loved with her own eyes was a very strange feeling. Of course, this wasn't jealousy. On the contrary, when she saw Shinjuli hugging her other self, her heart felt very warm. At the same time, she could rationally analyze it. The current Shinjuli probably only treated Xuema as a child that he had raised. He didn't have any feelings for her. Although this child was quite capable, and had even become the demon master, in his eyes, a child would always be a child. Although Xuema kept saying that she wanted to marry him, and even sent him a marriage proposal, he only treated it as a child's willfulness, and did not really take it to heart. Of course, he still took good care of this child. On the surface, he was cold to her, but when she was in danger, he would still save her. He had clearly left just now, but for some reason, he turned back and saved Xuema at a critical moment. As for that Luo Juchen, Ning Xuema thought about it, but she still hadn't heard of him. But it wasn't strange. Those people and things from 50,000 years ago were completely destroyed. Even the story of Shinjuli, the supreme divinity and the devil lord had only been passed down a little, let alone a minor character like Luo Juchen. However, Luo Juchen's kung fu was surprisingly high. From the fight between Shinjuli and him just now, it could be seen that the two of them were actually evenly matched. Shinjuli was slightly better than the other, but it was very limited. If they really fought, it would be impossible to determine the winner if the two of them didn't turn the sky and the earth upside down. And from the conversation between Shinjuli and him, the two of them had known each other for a long time. And the way they got along was very strange. They were neither enemies nor friends. And although Luo Juchen's actions were a little evil, the way he attacked was very righteous. He should be a cultivator. Chapter 1847. Ordinary cultivators could only kneel down and kowtow to Shinjuli when they saw him. Even the celestial emperor had to stand with his hands down and speak respectfully when he saw him. How could this person be so rude? Moreover, it was already very heaven-defying for his martial arts to reach such a high level. What was his origin? Was he also a god? No, it seemed that there was only one god, and it was impossible for a second one to appear. Moreover, his attitude towards Xuema was also very strange. His words were quite ambiguous, and it didn't seem like he was simply flirting with a little girl. Of course, this person looked like a show-off, as if he was a hedonistic son of a wealthy family who often took liberties with women from good families for fun. She couldn't rule out the possibility that after knowing Xuema's identity, he would take the opportunity to take liberties with this little devil master. However, what did he mean by a scholar who has been away for 3 days should be looked at with new eyes? From his words, it seemed like he had known Xuema in the past. Could it be that Xuema had interacted with him before? But with Xuema's temperament, If she had interacted with this person before, it was impossible for her not to recognize him. She had clearly seen him for the first time. Or was this person just saying it casually? Ning Xuema was puzzled. When she looked up again, she found that the scene in front of her had changed. The bed curtain was flowing with light ripples, and the screen was painted with Buddhist lotuses. The scene in front of her was very familiar to Ning Xuema. This was the side hall of the Fantian Palace. She had once slept for a night and dreamed of the past 50,000 years in this side hall. It turned out that more than 50,000 years ago, Xuema had come to this Fantian Palace. Ning Xuema looked down and saw little Xuema lying on the bed, unable to move, but her face was getting redder and redder, and her breathing was getting more and more rapid. Shinjili was not here. He must have gone to refine the antidote for her. Little Xuema was in great pain. She was still wearing Shinjili's loose white robe. She felt scorching hot, inexplicably empty, and irritable. She felt as if there were many insects crawling in her veins, making her whole body itch unbearably. This kind of itch was different from the itch she was allergic to. This kind of itch seemed to directly invade her heart, making her blood boil. To prevent her from moving around, Shinjili sealed her acupoints. It was not good for her body to seal her acupoints at this time, so he sealed her acupoints very gently. Little Xuema's blood was flowing fast, so she violently attacked the sealed acupoints. Ning Xuema looked at her from the air and saw her subconscious intention. She couldn't help but fly over. "No, you can't attack your acupoints or else you'll go berserk." Of course, little Xuema didn't hear her. Her body trembled even more violently. After a while, her body suddenly shook and she jumped up from the bed. Obviously, her acupoints were unsealed. The light at the door dimmed, and Shinjili walked in. Before he could see the situation in the room clearly, little Xuema had already rushed over like a cannonball and wrapped herself around his body like an octopus. Shinjili's body stiffened. At this time, little Xuema had already removed all the restraints on her body. She was completely naked, and she had completely lost her mind. After hugging him, she immediately searched for his lips with her lips. "Jilly, hug me, hug me." She was like a burning charcoal, clinging to him tightly. Shinjili wanted to pull her away, but he couldn't find a place to touch. Everywhere he touched was smooth and hot. Perhaps it was the effect of the medicine, or perhaps she was self-taught, but her little hands began to grope around his body. Chapter 1848. Shinjili shook his arms and a white light flashed. Little Xuema, who was tightly wrapped around him, flew out and fell into the quilt. The quilt automatically rolled over and wrapped around her tightly, making her unable to move. Her acupoints were sealed again, and this time it was quite heavy. It was difficult for her to even blink, let alone move her hands and feet. Shinjili's breath was slightly unstable. He walked over and looked down at her little face, which was flushed with blood. "Now you've learned your lesson. Don't trust others so easily just because you're good at martial arts. This world is not as simple as you think. Strong fists can't solve all problems." As he lectured her, he stuffed a purple pill into her mouth. "Eat it. You'll be fine after eating it." Shinjili was very confident in the pill he had refined. After little Xuema swallowed the pill, he said, "Have a good rest. You'll be fine after a good night's sleep." Then he turned around and left. Ning Xuema, who had been watching from the side, couldn't help but touch her eyebrows. "Almighty, you should at least wait for her to be cured before leaving." She was already burning hot, and now that she was wrapped in such a blanket and her acupoints were sealed, the blood in her body was blocked. From a medical point of view, it was very easy for her to go berserk like this. As if to verify Ning Xuema's medical theory, little Xuema's little face, which was lying in the quilt, became redder and redder. 10 minutes later, her nose, mouth, the corners of her eyes, and ears began to bleed. This was a typical case of bleeding from the 7 orifices. Ning Xuema wanted to help her unseal her acupoints and lift the quilt, but she couldn't do it. Besides watching from the side, she couldn't do anything useful. She wanted to rush out and call for help, but this dream was very strange. She seemed to be imprisoned by little Shuima's side and couldn't go anywhere. She could only stay in this room. And she was even more surprised to find that the pill that Shinjili fed little Shuima was obviously ineffective. An hour had passed, and her face was already blue and purple. The extreme pain made her like a fish out of water. She opened her mouth wide, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make a sound. Ning Shuima's heart was also tightly curled up. After all, this was her previous life. To be exact, it was not her previous life, but her past. Because she had now recovered her identity as the Devil Master, and her body was the body of a devil. Although she had forgotten what happened 50,000 years ago, it was now in front of her eyes. She could still feel the pain at that time. It was a pain worse than death. All the blood vessels in his body felt like they were about to burst. He was like a balloon filled with air, ready to explode at any moment. This was not an ordinary aphrodisiac drug. Although it was an aphrodisiac, it was very well, and to see it to see. If she couldn't really get rid of it, this little devil master might really die here. Ning Shuima couldn't help but look out the window again and again, hoping that Shinjuli would quickly come back to take a look. She didn't know how much time had passed, but it seemed as long as a century. The door of the hall opened again, and Shinjuli appeared at the door with his white clothes fluttering in the wind. Better, his words suddenly stopped. He rushed over like lightning. Shuima. Shuima's palm-sized face was already dripping with blood, and the blue veins on her face were popping out. Her mouth was wide open, and it seemed that she was already exhaling more than she was inhaling. Chapter 1849. Shinjuli lifted her up and unsealed her sealed acupoints with a slap on his palm. Wah! The moment Shuima's acupoint was unsealed, she spat out a mouthful of blood. She spat out large mouthfuls of blood. Shinjuli's hands were trembling as he hugged her. He couldn't care about anything else and pressed his palm on her naked back, wanting to help her tidy up her blood vessels. However, the blood vessels in her body seemed to have gone berserk. The moment his palm touched her, it was bounced off by the power in her body. Her eyes were red, and she used all her strength to push him away. Let go. The strength in her palm wasn't small. Under the surge of devil power, Shinjuli's body swayed slightly. And because of this palm, her already weak blood vessels couldn't take it anymore. She spat out blood again and her body went limp. Her face turned pale and she collapsed in his arms. She closed her eyes, and no one knew if it was blood or tears that rolled down from the corners of her eyes. Ning Shuima looked at all of this, and she didn't know what to feel in her heart. At that time, she had indeed gone mad, resulting in many of her blood vessels breaking apart. She was lucky that she didn't lose her life. A hint of apology flashed past Shinjuli's eyes. I'm sorry. She was still naked, and Shinjuli couldn't be bothered to help her put on her clothes. He laid her flat on the bed, and like playing a pipa, he tapped all the important acupoints on her body. A handsome young man dressed in white, and a young girl who was completely naked. This scene was actually very imaginative. Ning Shuima sat in front of Shinjuli attentively, watching him busy. Even though the great god didn't have that kind of feeling for her at that time, he still cared about her a lot, right? According to Mother Earth, only gods and devils falling in love would attract the purple fiend disaster. In that case, the two of them had already fallen in love 50,000 years ago, right? Shinjuli's medical expertise was already at the point of perfection at that time. After he connected Shuima's broken blood vessels, he casually put on a robe for her and carried her out of the door. Where was he taking her? Ning Shuima was a little puzzled, so she followed behind. When Ning Shuima first saw the layout of the hall and guessed that this was the Fantion Palace, she was a little uncertain. At this moment, after walking a small circle outside, she was finally completely sure that this was indeed Fantion Palace. The lake was suffused with rainbow-colored clouds, the pavilion of tortoiseshell. All of them were extremely familiar to him. Looking at Shinjuli walking quickly in front of her, Ning Shuima couldn't help but tear up. The Shinjuli in this world couldn't see her, but the Shinjuli in the other world had already disappeared. Compared to never being able to see him again, she would rather stay in this dream, even if she had to keep looking at him and not be able to hug him. She ran to his back and wrapped her arms around his waist. Of course, she could only hug him weakly, because if she used a little strength, her arms would pass through his body. In this dream, she could only hug herself. "Jilly," she whispered in her throat like a fool. Her arms hugged him weakly as if she was really close to him. "Great God," she murmured the old way of addressing him, "I really miss you. How can I make you come back?" She really missed his embrace. She really wanted him to hug her. In the side hall of the Fantion Palace, Shin Yenma was guarding by the bed, his little hand tightly holding the hand of the person on the bed. Chapter 1850. Shin Yenma stayed by the bed and held the hand of the person on the bed tightly. He cried, "Mother, mother." His mother vomited blood and fainted in front of the palace gate. Shin Yenma was small and weak. He did not want anyone to touch his mother, so he had to do it himself. However, his strength was limited, so he had to drag his mother to the side hall that was closest to the palace gate. It was not easy to get his mother onto the bed. He was almost sweating from exhaustion. He called out to her a few times. Seeing that she still hadn't woken up, he hurriedly ran to his father's bedroom to look at the bottles and jars his father had left behind. He found a few types of medicine to treat internal and external injuries and ran back with them all. He was too anxious. When he ran, he tripped on a stone under his feet and fell. He held the medicine bottle tightly in his arms, so it did not break. He only hurt his knees. He did not care about it. He got up and ran again. His mother was still waiting for him to save her life. He had already lost his father, so he did not want to lose his mother too. After all, Shin Yenma was still young and had not really learned any medical skills. Ning Shuima was severely injured by Mother Earth. When she was breaking the array of Mingling, she was stabbed by the weapon used by Mingling. That kind of weapon contained a very strong poison. On the surface, nothing could be seen. Even the blood that flowed out after being stabbed was bright red. However, the poison had already crawled to all parts of her blood vessels. When she was awake, she could use her magic to suppress it. However, when she was unconscious, she could not control it anymore. Her body was getting colder and colder. There was even a layer of frost on her body, which slowly turned into ice. Shin Yenma did not know how to deal with this illness. When he saw the sword wounds on his mother's body, he could only cry and apply a layer of medicine on her wounds. When he saw that there was no improvement, he let her take it orally. After he used everything, he realized that his mother did not have any signs of waking up. She did not even breathe. He was really scared. He did not care that her hand was cold to the bone. He held her hand tightly and did not let go. He cried and shouted, "Mother, mother, wake up. You can't abandon me, mother. I'm scared. Mother, give me a hug. I will warm you up." He desperately tried to squeeze into her arms and tried to warm her body with his little body. He was shivering in her arms from the cold. His lips were pale, but he refused to let go. His cries attracted the attention of the 8 mythological beasts. The most knowledgeable one, Bai Zhe, had followed the Divine Lord for so many years. It knew some medical knowledge. It looked at the mother and daughter lying on the bed and transformed into a human form. Then it carried out the little fellow who was almost frozen. "Little master, you can't do this." Shin Yenma's hands and feet were frozen, but he still did not want to leave his mother's arms. He struggled in Bai Zhe's hands. "I want to warm my mother up. She will wake up when I am warm." Bai Zhe said, "Little master, the devil master was injured by yin poison. She can't be warmed up by body heat. Then how do we wake her up?" In the past, the Divine Lord used to use his power to expel the yin poison. This is very costly. Shin Yenma's eyes widened. He immediately wanted to jump on the bed. "Then, I will use my power to expel the poison for my mother. What should I do?" Bai Zhe hurriedly pulled him back. "Little master, this person needs to be at least at the 6th level of the heaven rank. If you don't have enough telekinesis, you won't be able to do it." Chapter 1851. Can you do it? "No, we are only at the 3rd level of the heavenly level. We can't do it." "You can't do it even if you join forces?" We can't do it. Bai Zhe heard from the Divine Lord that the detoxification must be controlled properly. A little bit more will endanger the patient's life, and a little bit less will not work. If we join forces, we will not be able to save the Devil Master. We may even worsen her injury. What should we do? Shen Yanma's eyes were already filled with tears. Mother won't abandon me, will she? Bai Zhe pondered for a moment. Perhaps I should look for the Celestial Emperor. I remember that his power of will has reached the 6th level of the heavenly level. Shen Yanma shook his head. No, I am afraid that the Celestial Emperor will not try his best to save Mother. Bai Zhe was stunned and slapped his forehead. How could he forget about this? The Celestial Emperor did not really want the Devil Master to be well. It was hard to say if he would sincerely treat the Devil Master. What if he came and used a little trick? His young master was so young, but he actually knew about this. Bai Zhe raised his head to look at the frozen Ning Shuima on the bed. Suddenly, he thought of something and slapped his forehead. The Divine Venerable once said that in the future, if I encounter an emergency that I can't solve, I can look for someone. Who? A hermit who lives in seclusion. The Divine Lord said that if we ring the divine bell at the highest peak of the Fantion Palace 10 times, that person will appear. Shen Yanma immediately jumped up and ran out. What are we waiting for? Go and ring the bell. The pattern of the bell was very simple, and there were words engraved on it that no one could recognize. No matter how strong the wind was, it could not move the bell at all. Shen Yanma used to come here to play, so he was naturally curious when he saw the bell. He used to pick up the bell hammer next to him to strike it, but no matter how hard he tried, there was no sound. However, it was different this time. With Bai Zhe by his side, he learned that there was a set of very complicated incantations to ring the bell. A person with the blood of God had to recite the incantations and then ring the bell. Shen Yanma had a good memory, and he was eager to save his mother. Therefore, Bai Zhe only taught him the formula once, and he quickly memorized it. By the time he reached the top of the mountain, he had already memorized the chant. He picked up the hammer and chanted the incantation. Then he smashed the hammer down. The sound of the bell was loud and clear as it spread out in waves. As the first bell rang, there seemed to be some characters on the bell that faintly lit up and then extinguished. The words flashed too fast that Bai Zhe and Shen Yanma could not see what was written on it. The rune flickered in the air as it spun. A moment later, it actually condensed into a shadow. Shen Yanma was stunned when he saw the shadow. Bai Zhe opened his mouth wide and knelt down. Supreme Divinity! The shadow was wearing a wide robe with long sleeves and black hair hanging down. He stood there quietly and looked at the person who had rung the bell. That appearance was clearly Shen Juli. Shen Yanma screamed and rushed over. Father! Clang! He did not rush into his father's arms. Instead, he went straight through his father's body and hit the bell. He almost had a bump on his forehead. He quickly turned around and looked at the figure in a daze. His father was still standing there as if he was looking at him, but there was no expression on his face. It was indeed his father's appearance, but his temperament was too high and too cold. When he looked at him, it was as if he was looking down on all living things. Chapter 1852. Father! Shen Yanma pouted. His eyes were already filled with tears. He opened his arms to the figure. Father, give me a hug. Bai Zhe quickly pulled him back. Little master, this is the phantom of the Divine Lord, not the real person. He must have some instructions. The phantom finally spoke. It was Shen Juli's usual cold and indifferent voice. Is there really an emergency? This is the bell of heaven. Cannot be rung at will. Father, Mother is seriously injured. Her body is frozen. I can't wake her up. Shen Yanma was still a child. He cried out loud. Father, please save Mother. Shen Juli's phantom slightly lowered his eyes. There is indeed an emergency. You can ring the bell 3 times. Father, can you please save Mother? Shen Yanma missed him so much. At this moment, when he saw him standing not far away from him, he could not care about anything else. He opened his little arms and reluctantly threw himself at him. His body was in the air again. This time, he clearly saw his little body passing through the other person's body. It was not the other person who avoided him. Father. Shin Yenma's voice was hoarse. His big eyes were full of tears. Shin Juli's phantom disappeared. Bai Zai explained to Shin Yenma, "Little master, this is just a phantom set by the Divine Lord a long time ago. This bell is not a trivial matter, and it cannot be rung easily. The Divine Lord is afraid that someone accidentally rung the bell out of curiosity. So, he is not the real person. Little master, you should try to save your mother first." Shin Yenma was speechless. He rubbed his eyes and desperately tried to ring the bell again and again. When the bell rang for the 10th time, the big bell suddenly emitted a bright golden light. In the golden light, a person slowly emerged from the bell. The fire in the alchemy furnace was burning. A faint smell of medicine filled the entire hall. Ning Shuima did not expect that Shinjili would bring Shuima to the alchemy room. Little Shuima was seriously injured because of qi deviation. Her meridians were broken in many places, and the aphrodisiac was still wreaking havoc in her body, colliding with her blood vessels. Once he let go, those meridians would be broken again, and her little life might be lost. Shinjili, I love you so much. Shinjili, let go of me. Shinjili, I feel terrible. Boo-hoo. Fearing that her injuries would worsen, Shinjili no longer dared to seal her acupoints, so he only used his arms to encircle her in his embrace. Her little face was flushed red as she scratched his body. Not only did Shinjili have to carry her, but he also had to pay attention to the fire in the medicine refining furnace and the concoction of the herbs. Inevitably, it was a bit tiring, and his forehead was dripping with sweat. I'll refine the antidote for you. Be good and bear with it. It'll be over soon. He comforted her. Little Shuima was still a little clear-headed. The bloodstains on her face and body had been cleaned by him, but her eyes were still blood-red, as clear as gems. She tightly pursed her little mouth and endured bitterly. What the two of them did not expect was that the aphrodisiac was so overbearing. Shinjili consecutively concocted 3 or 4 different antidotes for her to consume, but there was almost no effect. The blood in little Shuima's body was boiling more and more fiercely. An inexplicable desire made even her bones itch. Her consciousness finally fell into a semi-confused state, and everything was left with her instincts. She subconsciously rubbed her legs and wrapped her body around Shinjili, as if he was the only source of her thirst. She rubbed against him like a snake. I feel terrible. I feel terrible. Chapter 1853. Although she was old enough to be a young girl, her body was still that of a 12 or 13-year-old. She was still very young. She usually did not pay attention to the matters between men and women, so she was still very ignorant about her own discomfort. Although she was very uncomfortable, she did not know how to solve it. She trembled and wrapped herself around his body, as if she could draw a little bit of coldness from him. Help me. No matter how calm Shinjili was, under her entanglement, he finally became a little unsteady. Be good. I'm helping you now. The next batch of medicine might... No, I don't want to take the medicine. Woo-woo, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Little Shuima's hands and feet moved chaotically. The outer robe that was draped over her body was once again torn apart by her actions. Lying naked in his embrace, she felt so uncomfortable that tears streamed down her face. Just let me die. Ooh, you won't help me. The medicine surged up again, and she vomited another mouthful of blood. Ning Shuima looked at them from the side and knew that it was not good. It seemed that this aphrodisiac could only be removed by real means, and looking at little Shuima's condition, it really could not be delayed any longer. Luo Juchen, that pervert. He actually used such a perverted method on little Shuima for no reason. When they were in the sea, if Shinjili had not saved her in time, she was afraid that she would have fallen into Luo Juchen's hands, and her virginity would have been taken away by Luo Juchen. Was that person crazy? How thirsty must he be to scheme against a child? Ning Shuima's gaze fell on Shinjili again. What method would he use to detoxify little Shuima? Could it be? Could it be? Just as she thought of this, Shun Jili suddenly stood up with little Shuama in his arms and said in a hoarse voice, "Okay, I'll help you." With a wave of his sleeve, a bed appeared out of thin air in the medicine refining hall. He quickly put her on the bed. Ning Shuama opened her mouth slightly. He really wanted to do it himself, but little Shuama's body was not mature yet. Could this bear him? Although Ning Shuama had only slept with Shun Jili once, she knew his body very well. His size was definitely not something that little Shuama's small body could bear. No matter what Shun Jili did, he always paid attention to the mood. Even the big bed that he had randomly created here was very beautiful. After he carried her in his arms, the light blue bed curtain with the blue sky and white clouds. In this kind of situation, Ning Shuama also knew that it was inappropriate to look on. Although she was extremely curious, she didn't want to be a spectator. However, in this strange dream, her actions were not based on her own will. She originally wanted to take a look at the medicine, but she did not expect that in the blink of an eye, she had already entered the bed curtain. Then, she felt the world spinning, and her vision darkened and brightened again. Then, she felt as if her whole body was burning up, and the heat in her body surged. Ning Shuama widened her eyes in shock, and her brain exploded. She actually entered little Shuama's body at this time, and not just a bystander at the side. She was lying in his arms with her clothes disheveled. She felt his heartbeat, smelled the unique fragrance on his body, and hugged his strong and sturdy body. She hugged him. She could touch him. Chapter 1854. The great joy even diluted the unbearable heat in her body. She stared at him with her eyes wide open. For a moment, she couldn't believe it. Her body seemed to be fixed and she couldn't move. Probably because her expression was too strange, Shun Jili raised his eyebrows slightly. His palm directly covered her wrist to check her pulse. "What's wrong? How do you feel?" She could feel the heat of his palm. His faint and light breath was on the top of her head. Everything couldn't be more real. She actually had his embrace again. Before she lost his embrace, she didn't feel anything. But after she lost it completely, she realized how much she longed for him. She longed for him so much that her heart ached. She didn't answer his question. She just stretched out her arms and hugged him tightly. Tears rolled down from her eyes drop by drop. Shun Jili's body stiffened when she hugged him. Her hug was like a reunion after a long separation. He paused for a moment. "Why are you—" He didn't finish his sentence because Ning Shuama had already raised her head and kissed him. Her hot lips covered his directly. "Jioli, I feel terrible." Her voice was very hoarse, but there was a strange tremor in it. Shun Jili held his breath. He held her arms with both hands and wanted to push her away. But when he saw the string of tears rolling down her cheeks, he seemed to be unable to bear it. While he was in a daze, she had already pounced on him like a hungry tiger pouncing on its prey. Her whole body lay on his chest. Her arms were around his neck. Her lips and tongue were wreaking havoc on his lips. Their tongues intertwined fiercely. She was originally wearing a casual robe. At this moment, under the violent movements, the robe was opened and hung loosely on her body. Her hot and smooth little body was completely in his arms. Through the thin clothes on his body, he could feel the scorching heat of her body. Shun Jili had been a god for so long. Although he understood the relationship between men and women very well, he had never practiced it and had no experience. When he carried little Shuama to the bed just now, he didn't really want to have sex with her. Instead, he wanted to use a special spell to treat her. Because that kind of treatment required him to take off all her clothes and lay her down, he simply conjured up a bed to make things easier. He was only doing this to bully her because she didn't understand this kind of thing. He guessed that no matter how upset she was, she wouldn't know what to do. But he didn't expect that she would pounce on him as if she was suddenly enlightened. Not only did she kiss him passionately, her little hand also reached into his lapel and her fingertips were caressing his sensitive spot. Shun Jili's body instantly froze. He raised his hand and grabbed her wrist, pulling her small hand out. "Who taught you these?" There was a trace of anger in his voice. In his impression, Shuama was still a child. Chapter 1855. In Shui Yimou's life, it might have been too long ago, so she didn't have a deep impression of him. But in Ning Shuima's life, she only had sex with him once, and it was when he forced himself on her, of course. That was when she had already fallen in love with him. But she still had some misgivings in her heart, so it could be considered a half-hearted refusal. The current great god shouldn't have that kind of feelings for little Shuima. The reason why he was entangled with her in this bed was probably purely to detoxify her poison. Although she didn't know what method he wanted to use, looking at his current expression, she knew that it wasn't a real physical intimacy, but something else. Could it be? He wanted to use his hands. At this moment, Ning Shuima's thoughts drifted 80,000 miles away. At this moment, she was still lying on top of Shun Jili's body. Her clothes were draped over her back, and her shoulders, calves, and even a part of her thighs were exposed. Her snow-white little feet were hooking onto his legs. The distance between the two couldn't be any closer, and there wasn't even a sliver of space between them. Shun Jili's clothes were disheveled as he allowed her to press down on him. His hand clasped her wrist, and the two of them looked at each other. "Speak!" His voice was extremely deep, as if a storm had condensed. Ning Shuima blinked her eyes. Perhaps it was because her soul had entered the body later than Ning Shuima's, in addition to her understanding of medicinal properties. So when she took over this body, the magic in her body automatically activated and forcibly suppressed the poison in her body. However, she was, after all, experienced human affairs, so she was extremely sensitive to this kind of desire in her body. What's more, the person pressing down on her body was her crazy husband. At this moment, she simply had the thought of stripping him naked and forcing herself on him. She gasped for breath, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead. She also couldn't answer Shin Jili's question. Could she say that she was his wife from 50,000 years in the future? Could she say that in this strange dream, she had possessed her previous body? No, she couldn't say it. Even if she said it, he wouldn't believe her. Maybe he would even think that she was someone else's soul, and use some kind of magic to forcibly expel her. Although this was a dream from 50,000 years ago, she was already very satisfied to be able to have such close contact with him in the dream. Therefore, she didn't answer his question. She just blinked her big watery eyes and spat out a few words. "I feel terrible. Jolie, I feel terrible." As she spoke, she used her toenails to gently rub the side of his leg. Thanks to Shui Yimou's memories, she knew that Shinjili's place was also a sensitive area. Her little hand was being held by him, so she couldn't reach into his clothes. She used her fingertips to draw circles on his chest. Ahem, this was not her experience. She had learned it from watching movies and TV dramas in the modern world. Art came from life, and some things in movies and TV series were also very practical. Ning Shuima's two moves seemed to be unintentional, but they made Shan Jili's body suddenly stiffen, and his breathing became slightly chaotic. He looked at the little girl in his arms whose face was flushed red, but her eyes were watery. Her eyes seemed to be able to speak, and there was a desire as well as an indescribable pain and love. She was no longer the girl who kept saying that she wanted to marry him, but was ignorant about love. He really doted on little Shuima. After all, she was a child that he had raised with his own hands. However, perhaps because she never grew up and looked like a child, he never had that kind of desire for her. Chapter 1856. But maybe because she never grew up and looked like a child, he never had that kind of desire for her. He only treated her as a child, even when she became the Devil Lord. Now that he saw her like this, he had a strange feeling in his heart for the first time. He had a feeling that he wanted to press her under his body. His eyes suddenly darkened as he stared at her. The expression in his eyes was unreadable. Shoma. His voice was low with a hint of dullness. The last syllable was slightly raised, as if there was a small hook that made her heart tremble. "Do you know what you're doing now?" How could she not know? She just wanted to seduce him. She just wanted to be close to him, even if it was with this small body. She longed for him so much that she was going crazy. She loved him so much that she wanted to merge with him, not to mention that her body was still burning from the attack of the desire poison. She lowered her head and kissed the tip of his nose. Her hot breath was on the side of his lips. Jolie, I, I want to sleep with you. Little Shuama often said these two words. Every time Shinjuli heard it, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Naturally, he didn't lower himself to her level. Now that he heard it, his heartstrings trembled slightly. Her eyes were watery, and her small face was as red as an apple. Because of her desire, her skin was pink, and there was a thin layer of sweat on her forehead. Her small mouth, which was originally like a cherry blossom petal, was now like a dewy rose, as if it was tempting people to pick it. His dark blue eyes seemed to have stars floating in them. Sleep with you? Did she really know what sleep with him was? He reached out his hand and wiped her sweaty forehead with his fingertips. Then, he tucked her hair behind her ear. Good girl. Tell me, what sleep with you is? If it was little Shuama, he reckoned that she would have buried herself in his embrace and told him that sharing a room was just sleeping on the same bed. This was also why little Shuama couldn't understand why Shinjuli didn't agree to her marriage. If he slept with her, she would grow up. It was such a simple thing, yet he still refused. It was obvious that he didn't like her. However, Ning Shuama was the one who possessed her body. She blinked her eyes and didn't know how to answer, although Shinjuli had been lying on the bed, allowing her to lie on top of him as if she was a fish on a chopping board. His eyes were fixed on her face, and there was a touch of contemplation in his eyes. A hand gently caressed the back of her head. Ning Shuama was, after all, very sensitive. She could clearly feel his divine sense probing into her body. He was probably suspicious of her. He probably wanted to see if her body had been taken over by other wandering spirits. Suddenly, his fingers paused. Ning Shuama's heart trembled, but her eyes widened as she stared at him. Although she came later, this body was originally her body, so her soul didn't feel out of place in it at all. He shouldn't be able to find anything, right? She didn't want him to probe any further. She tilted her head and kissed him on the lips. Her voice trembled. It's the pleasure of us sleeping together. Shinjuli stiffened slightly. He tilted his head, and Ning Shuama's lips touched his ear. She cursed bitterly in her heart. When a man wanted to rape a woman, he just needed to use his strength to suppress her. However, when a woman wanted to rape a man, especially a man with terrifying self-control, it was like a dog biting a hedgehog. There was no place to bite. Chapter 1857. She had been lying on top of him for so long, but she did not feel that he was aroused. She knew what he looked like when he was aroused. Even if he did not have sex with her, the changes in his body could not lie. She made up her mind and curled up one of her legs deliberately to touch that place under his white robe. However, before her leg could do anything, it was pinned down by his leg. His eyes became deep. I did not teach you this. Who taught you this? Ning Shuama blurted out, me? Shinjuli raised his eyebrows. Are you sure? Ning Shuama's heart skipped a beat, and she finally changed her words. Of course, you did not teach me, but I have been in the devil world for so many years, and I have heard some things. How can I not know? So it was because of what you heard in the devil world? There was no emotion in his voice, but there was a hint of coldness. Yes. Ning Shuama nodded. Anyway, the relationship between men and women in the devil world had always been messy, so he could not suspect anything. Shinjuli's eyes flashed with a glimmer of light. He seemed to be joking. Okay, I will lie here. How are you going to sleep with me? Was he flirting with her? Also, from his tone, did he have a hobby of being raped? Speaking of which, why didn't he blush or pant when he said these things to a child? His tone was still a bit like teasing a child. Damn it! Women were naturally shy when it came to this kind of thing. Ning Shuama was no exception, even if she had experienced 2 lives, and even if she had been a secret agent. However, she was bolder now. Although she was blushing, since she had seized this opportunity, she wanted to continue doing it. She had not slept with him many times, and she had already died several times. It was too unfair. With this thought, Ning Shuama decisively took the initiative. Anyway, she had to cover her face. She was not afraid. She blinked and said in a tender voice, "Are you really going to let me do whatever I want? You've learned a lot of nonsense. There was no emotion in Shun Jili's voice. He raised his hand and pinched her cheek. At this time he actually said, "You look so ugly, Ning Shuama." Big brother. Saying such words at a time like this is like pouring cold water on people. Okay? Of course, she knew what she looked like now. Her face was still disfigured. She gritted her teeth and simply leaned against his ear and chuckled. It's the same even if the lights are off. You can imagine when my skin was white and clean. Shun Jili? This conversation was too adult. The light in his eyes faintly flickered, and his palm stroked the middle of her back. My eyesight is good. Whether the lights are off or not, it's all the same. His fingertips gently stroked her scratched back. It was obviously a very simple action, but it made Ning Shuama, who was extremely sensitive due to the drug, tremble. Her waist went soft, and she almost collapsed in his arms. She took a deep breath and tried to support herself. She wanted to raise her hands, but found that her hands were still restrained by him. She curled her lips and smiled. Don't tell me you're going to let me do whatever I want? What's the point of holding my hands? She looked very charming when she curled her lips and smiled. Her eyes were also very lively. There was a kind of charm that Shun Jili had never seen before, and it hit his heartstrings heavily. His eyes deepened slightly, and he let go of her hands. Okay, you can continue. His eyes flashed with a hint of a smile. Sure enough, he continued to lie there and let her do whatever she wanted. Chapter 1858. He kept looking at her. No one could see any emotion in his eyes, but Ning Shuama still panicked from his stare. She had the urge to turn around and run away. However, her extreme thirst for him made her want to continue. She steeled her heart and tore open his lapel, exposing a large patch of his moonlight white skin to her eyes. So beautiful. The Almighty's figure was really perfect. He was so perfect that she couldn't find any flaws. Her little hand caressed his collarbone, as if she was touching a fine sculpture. You're really good-looking, she praised him. Shun Jili did not say anything. She was not the only one who complimented his good looks. However, when she said it in her soft voice, his heart skipped a beat. He continued to stare at her, waiting to see how far she could go. He was originally trying to coax her with a joking attitude. After all, she had been holding it in for too long. It wasn't good for her to be depressed in her heart. He wanted to let her play for a while so that her depression could be released. It would also be convenient for him to use a special method to expel the poison from her body. But now, there was a strange feeling rising from within his body, making his aura slightly unstable. Ning Shuama also made up her mind. Wasn't it just taking the initiative? Although she hadn't taken the initiative before, she had seen a pig run before. She lowered her body and kissed his neck, his Adam's apple, his collarbone, his chin, his lips, and finally his ear. She curled her little tongue and sucked his earlobe into her mouth, gently biting it twice. The man's body stiffened again. Ning Shuama was surprised to find that his body seemed to have a reaction. She felt a certain part of his body touching her. Thus, she blushed and rubbed herself against him. Shun Jili suddenly turned over. Ning Shuama felt the world was spinning. When she opened her eyes again, she was already under him. He was pressing her so tightly that she couldn't move at all. She didn't feel anything when she was on top of him, but now that she was being pressed down by him, she could feel a strong sense of urgency from him. It made her heart beat wildly. He stretched out a finger and placed it on her little mouth. There was a dark light in his eyes. Shuama, you're playing with fire. Ning Shuama raised her eyebrows and looked up at him. His face was still calm, but his chaotic heartbeat betrayed him. A certain part of his body betrayed him. She didn't answer him. Instead, she raised her hand and hooked his neck. She kissed his Adam's apple and breathed into his ear. Julie, give it to me. Give it to me, okay? If you don't save me, I'll die. Shuama, I only treat you as a child. Shun Jili sighed and held her hand that was burning the fire. Bear with it. I will find another way to save you. He did not want to play with her anymore. I'm not young anymore. I'm thousands of years old. She raised her head and nibbled on his collarbone. His body stiffened again. But I raised you with my own hands. You're like my own daughter. He couldn't change his mind. Ning Shuima's face darkened. She knew it. She was raised by a man when she was naked. It was really sad. But I'm not your biological daughter. I'm not related to you by blood. Jolie, I only see you as my husband. Ning Shuima kissed his chin again. The last two words obviously made Shinjili pause. Husband? Do you know what a husband does? Protect me. Pity me. Go through hardships with me. Have children with me. And never leave my side. Chapter 1859. Ning Shuima felt tears welling up in her eyes as she spoke. She and Shinjili had been entangled with each other for 3 lifetimes. Now that they were finally together, he was still asking questions. She raised her hands to hug his waist and pressed her face against his chest. I miss you. I really miss you. His chest was damp from her burning tears. Her voice contained an indescribable sadness, causing his heart to suffocate as if it was drowning. He lowered his eyes to look at the little person in his embrace. He calmed down and tried to suppress something. Shuima, the reason why you can't grow up isn't. It's not because of this. I'm thinking of a way to make you grow up. Give me some time. I won't leave you alone. It turned out that Shinjili was not indifferent to her growth. He was also looking for a way to make her grow up. You won't be able to find it in this lifetime. Ning Shuima blurted out. If he could find it in this lifetime, she wouldn't look like a child when she was reborn. What did you say? Shinjili wanted to see her face clearly, but she clung onto him like an octopus. Her head was pressed tightly against his chest. It was impossible for him to pull her off him even if he wanted to. Nothing. Ning Shuima also knew that she had let it slip. She listened to his heartbeat greedily. She didn't know how long she could stay in this little body, so she wanted to hug him for as long as she could. She didn't want to talk to him anymore. If they talked in this position, all the ambiguity would be gone. Moreover, she could feel that the inexplicable heat flow in her body was getting faster and faster. A huge desire was surging in her body like a tidal wave, making her feel the pain in her veins again. Her head was buzzing, and her mind was filled with the images of her rolling with him. Her breathing became more and more rapid, and her whole body was so hot that it was almost burning. His lapel had been messed up by her, and a large part of it was open. It was very tempting. I don't feel good, Jolie. I really like you. Her voice was filled with urgency. She felt like she was going to explode from the desire poison. The poison was too overbearing, and she was losing control. Shinjili took a light breath and raised his hand to hold her in place. You want me not just to cure the poison that prevents you from growing up? Isn't it because I'm the strongest person in the world? No. Ning Shuima shook her head and said word by word. I like you, Jolie, I like you. She couldn't help but raise her head to look for his lips. There was a bit of resentment in her voice as she said, Didn't you say that you would let me do whatever I want? You didn't keep your word. Before she could finish her sentence, she felt a sudden warmth on her lips. Her lips were sealed tightly by his. Shuima, it's not good for you to do this kind of thing. His voice was slightly hoarse, and his pair of cold eyes were as deep as a well. It was as if he wanted to swallow her whole. However, there was a kind of determination in his voice. His lips were on her lips. Shuima, once we start, we can't stop anymore. Don't you regret it? Ning Shuima's heart was beating like a drum. She knew what Shinjili meant. He wanted her, but could her body withstand him? She swallowed a mouthful of saliva. She didn't care anymore. If it hurts, so be it. She put her hands around his neck and let him get closer to her. She answered him with 3 words. I don't regret it. After thinking for a while, she added, You have to be gentler. I'm too tender. Chapter 1860. She put her hands around his neck and let him lean closer to her. She answered him with 3 words. No. After thinking for a while, she added, You have to be gentler. I'm a little tender. When she said the last 4 words, she regretted it. She was afraid that he would use this reason to back off. Just a little tender. Actually, it's enough. After saying this, she felt like her face was burning. Right now, she was like an anxious woman who was begging him to come to her. Shunjili did not say anything, but there was a hint of a smile in his eyes. He pressed his fingers on her back and rubbed it hard. There was a faint white light flashing. Ning Shuima's body suddenly heated up. There was a loud bang in her head. She felt dizzy and thought that her soul was flying away again. When the strong dizziness passed, she quickly opened her eyes and found that she was still in Shunjili's arms. He was still half pressing on her. His eyes were fixed on her body. His fingertips brushed the corner of her lips. Shuima. There was a hint of lingering in his voice. He leaned over and held her in his arms. Their bodies were tightly pressed together. Ning Shuima even felt that her breasts were pressed against his chest. When he moved slightly, he felt as if he had been electrocuted. Breasts. Ning Shuima subconsciously lowered her head. She exclaimed softly and opened her eyes wide. Full breasts, slender waist, slender legs, and exquisite curves. How was this the body of a 12 or 13-year-old child? It was clearly the body of a 16-year-old girl. She suddenly looked up. You have a way to make me grow up. There was surprise and anger in her words. She had been depressed for thousands of years with this lowly face. She had been worried about whether she could grow up or not. She was almost desperate to grow up. She did not expect that he could make her mature with just a spell. This person was too hateful. Why didn't he use it earlier? He knew how much she wanted to grow up. Shunjili only replied with 4 words, 2 hours. Ning Shuima widened her eyes and quickly understood. Are you saying that I can last for 4 hours in this adult form? Shunjili looked down at her and said, It seems that you have become a lot smarter. Ning Shuima opened her mouth and wanted to ask him more, but Shunjili hugged her tightly. He raised his hand and spread her hair. Her hair spread out on the pillow and spread out under her body. Shuima, are you sure you want to continue talking to me? His fingers caressed her delicate neck, where the veins were throbbing. It was obvious that although her body had turned into an adult, the poison in her body had not disappeared. It was still wreaking havoc in her body, but she was barely able to suppress it. His gaze was focused, and his voice was a little hoarse. His slight panting made her heart beat wildly, and her small face could not help but turn red. Her small hand was still pushing his shoulder. She subconsciously wanted to take it back, but he held it and kissed her fingers. The tickling feeling went straight to her heart. Are you shy? Shunjili said in a low voice. His voice was right next to her ear, with a hint of teasing. I thought, you didn't know how to be shy. Fortunately, Ning Shuima only felt that her face was burning. Until this moment, she finally understood that she could never compare with the Almighty in terms of shamelessness. Once he decided to do something, he would do it calmly, and no one could change his mind. Chapter 1861. Just like now, she was the one who took the initiative at the beginning, but now she was completely passive. She could feel his hands moving around her body. His fingertips were hot, but his movements were calm. With a flick of his fingertips, he took off her belt and slid inside her clothes. Her body trembled and she gave a soft snort, but then she held her breath. Wasn't he being too? That? He hadn't even started yet and she had already made a sound. Would she leave a bad impression on him in this world? She hadn't even finished thinking about this when her lips were forcefully pried open by him. His pleasant voice sounded in a low voice. Don't suppress it, just follow your heart. His kiss was forceful and domineering. He attacked her lips without leaving any leeway. She was hugging his real body and not an empty dream. Just thinking about this was enough to make her blood boil. Her hands trembled as she hugged his waist and raised her head to receive his kiss. The familiar scent that belonged to him filled her nose, making her heart feel like a balloon that was filled with air. It was as if it was about to fly. His fingertips were warm as they brushed against her skin, making her unable to stop herself from trembling. She already loved him so much, and with the effects of the drug, her body was very sensitive. Just a gentle touch and a gentle kiss from him was enough to make her heart beat like crazy. Their breaths were all hot and their breaths intertwined, causing the temperature in the tent to rise rapidly. His lips and tongue were everywhere, igniting clusters of flames wherever they went, causing her body to tremble uncontrollably. "Great God!" she muttered. Her hands went into his smooth hair. She wanted to push him away, but she also wanted to press him into her body. When she said that she wanted to do something to him, she said it in a righteous manner, but at this moment all the strength in her body disappeared. Her little hand was in a pushing position, but she didn't have the strength to push him away. The blood in her body seemed to be boiling, making her face turn red like a tomato. Her heart was filled with extreme joy and extreme warmth. In her impression, her first time with him wasn't in a situation where both of them were willing, so it wasn't a good one. At that time, he was punishing her, and she felt wronged because of his dominance. Unlike now, even though she was drugged, she really liked how he treated her, and he seemed to be very willing to do so. He kissed her deeply again and again, and she responded to him again and again. Their clothes were tossed out of the tent one after another. When their skin touched, she couldn't help but hug him tightly as she felt his sweaty and hot body. "Shoma, it will hurt a little," he whispered in her ear, and she replied carelessly. Her head was so hot that it was burning into a paste. Actually, she didn't even hear what he said clearly. Finally, he slowly entered. Ning Shuama's body stiffened slightly. It still hurt a little, however. This pain was nothing compared to the pain she had suffered in the past. It was completely within her tolerance range. Moreover, this pain was caused by the man she loved the most, so she didn't care about this pain at all. This was the kind of romance that should only happen on their wedding night. This should be the first time they did it together. Warmth mixed with an indescribable pain wreaked havoc in her chest, and she couldn't help but tear up. Chapter 1862. Does it hurt? He leaned over her body. His breath was very unstable, but his movements were very restrained. He lowered his head and kissed the sweat on her forehead and the tears at the corner of her eyes. He thought she was crying because of the pain. His hot breath blew on the side of her neck. She raised her arms and hugged him. Then, she took the initiative to kiss him. The fire in the medicine cauldron gradually extinguished, but the temperature in the bed curtain rose with the rise and fall of the figure inside. Soft moans came from there intermittently. From time to time, one or two sentences with low breaths floated by along with the rise and fall of the bed curtain. "Don't force yourself. It's not good for the antidote at this time. Come, call me out. You made love with me. Just to detoxify, that's the main reason." Shinjuli's voice was calm. He admitted it generously. "Be good. Don't let my sacrifice down. Call me out. Sacrifice? She was the one who sacrificed herself, right? She was originally just a bystander. Suddenly, she was dragged in to have sex with him. If it wasn't for the fact that she loved him so much, she would have kicked him down just for saying those words." She suddenly laughed softly. "What are you laughing at?" His voice sounded surprised. "You did make a sacrifice." Her voice was slow and purposely dragged out. "Then, do you want me to compensate you? I have a luminous pearl as big as the moon in my demon palace. Just take it as a reward for your hard work this time." He seemed to have done something abruptly that made her cry out, but she couldn't say the rest of her words. "Hey you, be gentler. Since I've given you a reward for your hard work, I have to be worthy of your luminous pearl." His voice was quite calm. So, 50,000 years ago, Shinjuli was already so black-bellied. However, she had known Shinjuli for so long after all. She knew his temper deeply. He didn't care about anything and could let go of anything. He was cold and indifferent when dealing with people. His identity also made him used to being high and mighty, giving people a feeling that he couldn't be blasphemed. However, he did things as he pleased. If he liked someone, he liked them. If he loved someone, he loved them. Once he was sure of his feelings, he would not back down. He would even forcefully plunder them. In front of the person he loved, There was nothing he couldn't do. Ning Shuama didn't know what the original development was. But at this moment, she understood that Shun Jili had already fallen in love with little Shuama, but he didn't know it. He always thought that his feelings for her were like his own child. At that time, little Shuama didn't understand the pleasure between a man and a woman. If Ning Shuama didn't possess Shuama's body, little Shuama wouldn't know what to do no matter how uncomfortable she felt. In all likelihood, the relationship between her and Shinjili would not be broken. Shinjili still did not know her feelings for him and still treated her like a child. As for the poison this time, other than the most direct method, what else could he do? There was a hint of doubt in her mind. Can you still be distracted at this time? His low voice seemed to be mixed with a faint threat, which made her heart tremble slightly. She was about to open her mouth to argue, but her slightly opened mouth suddenly screamed. Time intertwined, and the moonlight slowly moved on the gauze curtain. The night was still long, but their beautiful life had just begun. Shin Yanma looked at the person who slowly appeared from the golden light in surprise. It was a very handsome young man. His purple robe shone under the sunlight, and his whole person was as refined as an orchid tree. What was more strange was that this person had a head of silver hair. The silver hair was like the satin of the moonlight that hung behind his back. Chapter 1863. The moment he appeared, his eyes were slightly closed as if he was asleep. He slowly opened his eyes when the golden light disappeared. His eyes were extremely dark as if they were condensed into the night sky. Finally, you are out, he sighed softly. His voice was as ethereal as a breeze. Shin Yanma looked at him in a daze. He could not figure out who he was. After a moment of silence, he asked, Who are you? The man first glanced at Bai Zhe, then finally fixed his eyes on Shan Yanma's face. After a moment of careful observation, he suddenly smiled. I am the one who can solve your problems. If you have any requests, just let me know. Shin Yanma's eyes lit up. He had a lot of requests now. Can you help me with any request I have? Shin Yanma asked in a crisp voice. The man smiled like a spring breeze slowly brushing across the lake. Of course, I am a god. I can satisfy all your requests. Oh, that was great. There were other gods that he could ask for help from. Shin Yanma's eyes were even brighter. You are a god, too? Then, when he was about to speak, the man continued, however, I can only promise to solve one problem for you. You have to think carefully before you speak. Shin Yanma was speechless. There were two problems that needed to be solved urgently. One was to bring his father back, and the other was to wake his mother up. He stood there and hesitated. The man looked at him with a smile and gently tapped the fan in his hand. He always had a bad taste. He liked to see people struggling to make a decision so that he could feel a sense of accomplishment. Obviously, the little guy in front of him had something urgent to ask of him, but it must be more than one thing. It was difficult for a child to make a decision, so he opened the fan and smiled. Don't worry, you can think about it slowly. He waved the fan and wanted to walk around and enjoy the scenery first. Unexpectedly, Shin Yanma immediately said, Okay, I beg you, you have to bring my father back. As long as his father came back, it should be easy for him to wake up his mother. There was no need for this man to do anything, and the family of three could be reunited. It was a great choice. Even Bai Zhe could not help but give the young master a thumbs up. The young master was indeed very decisive. The man stopped moving his fan and looked at Shin Yanma. Who is your father? Shun Jili, the divine lord of this world. Shin Yanma held his head high. The man's lips twitched slightly. He looked at Shin Yanma and pondered for a moment. What other requests do you have? Shin Yanma blinked his big eyes. As long as you can save my father, I don't need you to do anything else. That person, can you agree to this condition? Shin Yanma asked. The fan in the man's hand stiffened, and he sighed slightly. This request, perhaps you have to change your request. He did not expect that he would not be able to fulfill this child's first request. Shin Yanma's eyes dimmed for a moment. He pouted and said, So, Your promise just now was just a bluff. That person coughed lightly. In this world, there was only one thing he couldn't do. I can fulfill your other requests. When a god disappears, it truly disappears. Not even a soul remains. So, Shin Nianma's facial expression changed drastically. He glared at the man. Nonsense. My father didn't disappear. Mother said that my father was seriously injured and is in isolation. He will come out after a while. Chapter 1864. The man was speechless. He did not want to argue with a child. His eyes flickered slightly, and he said faintly, "It is up to you to believe it or not. Little guy, I can fulfill your other two wishes. If you don't tell me, I will leave." He pretended to leave. Shin Nianma did not stop him. He looked at the bell with his big eyes and pursed his lips. He was still very smart. Since his father had locked this person in this bell and had used a special summoning technique to summon him out, in order to make this person keep his word, he must have set up an extremely powerful restriction. If this person couldn't fulfill one of his conditions, he was afraid that he would suffer a backlash from the bell. The man pretended to walk a few steps, but when he saw that Shin Nianma did not speak, he finally stopped. "You still haven't thought about it?" This little guy was too calm. Shin Nianma looked at him. "You have to fulfill 3 conditions." The man's handsome face darkened. "Little guy, don't be greedy. If you are greedy, I will not fulfill any of your conditions." Shin Nianma crossed his arms. "Then don't fulfill any of them. Bai Zai, let's go." He turned around and pretended to go down the mountain. Bai Zai opened its mouth and did not understand what the little master was trying to do. It was stunned for a moment and did not speak. It followed behind Shin Nianma. The man was speechless. He had underestimated this little guy. This little guy was really a weirdo. He could be compared to his father. Shin Nianma had guessed correctly. He was locked in the bell by Shin Juli with a special method. If he wanted to get out, he had to unconditionally fulfill one of the requests of the person who released him. If he could not do it, he could not get out of the bell at all times. Before he fulfilled the request, unless the person who released him asked him to follow, he could not leave the bell at all. After he got out, he wanted to fool the other party because he was a child. He wanted to make a request and fulfill it so that he could get real freedom. However, he did not expect this little guy to be so smart. As long as Shin Nianma walked down the mountain, this person would have to be locked in the bell again. He did not know when he would be released again. Therefore, that person rubbed the space between his eyebrows with his fan and could only say, "Little thing, come back. What are your 3 requests?" Unknowingly, he had made a concession. Shin Nianma turned around. "Have you agreed?" The man, "Tell me about it first. I'll only tell you if you promise." The man's face sank. "Little thing, don't bargain with me. Don't tell me that I have to agree to your ridiculous conditions. Didn't you say that other than the condition of my father's return, you would satisfy all the other conditions? So you're lying again." That man, he was actually being bullied by a child. He looked at Shin Nianma and could not help but laugh. "What if your condition is for me to die and go into self-exile?" This little thing was too strange, so he had to be cautious. Shin Nianma stared at him with disdain. "You are measuring the heart of a gentleman with the yardstick of a villain. I am not that bored. As long as you don't threaten me and my family, I don't care if you live or die." The man was speechless. Was this something a child would say? The man was almost speechless. After some bargaining, the man finally agreed to help Shin Nianma with 3 things. Chapter 1865. After a round of bargaining, the man finally agreed to help Shin Nianma with 3 things. Of course, it had to be under the condition that his safety was not threatened. The first request that Shin Nianma made was to save his mother. His mother was injured and in a coma. However, he had not thought of the second and third requests yet. The man rubbed his eyebrows and sighed at the power of genes. Shin Juli's son was such a jerk. He did not know that Shin Juli's son was such a jerk. "What is your name?" Shin Nianma asked in the end. That person's lips curled into a smile. "If this question is a condition, I will tell you. Shen Yanma turned and walked away. Then you don't have to tell me. I will call you Hey from now on. The man's lips twitched. He smiled leisurely. Forget it. I will not argue with a child like you. My name is Dao Tianchen. You can call me God Chun or Uncle Chun. God? Except for his father, no one could be called a god. Shen Yanma immediately said his second condition. You can't be called a god. You can't be called a god. Dao Tianchen was speechless. He was a little regretful that he had agreed to the 3 conditions of this little guy too early. His eyes flashed slightly, and he did not know what to think. He smiled gently. Okay. Shen Yanma and Bai Zhe were both relieved. They could not accept someone else being called a god. There was a faint cold fragrance in the hall. On the bed in the hall there was a human-shaped ice block. A woman in red was lying in the ice block. She looked alive as if she was asleep. The moment Dao Tianchen saw the woman's face, he stopped in his tracks. The fan in his hand fell to the ground. "Imo!" Shen Yanma suddenly rushed over. "Mother!" His voice was trembling. When he went out, there was no layer of ice on his mother's body. Now it had become an ice coffin. He wanted to feel his mother's pulse, but only a thick piece of ice could be felt. He gritted his teeth and wanted to melt the ice. A fan reached over and pried his little hand away. Dao Tianchen's voice was unprecedentedly serious. "If you don't want your mother to die, then don't move." Shen Yanma did not dare to move. Dao Tianchen stared fixedly at Ning Shuima, who was lying there. No one knew what he was thinking. "Hey, you have to save my mother," Shen Yanma urged him. "I will save her." Dao Tianchen did not hesitate this time. "All of you, get out." Shen Yanma was speechless. He did not want his mother to be alone with this unknown man. "Just go ahead and save them. I will stay here obediently and not make a sound. I will reduce my presence," Shen Yanma quickly said. Dao Tianchen narrowed his eyes. "Little guy, I'll give you 2 choices. 1, let your mother die, and I'll break my promise and lock you up in the heavenly Dao Bell. 2, all of you get out. I will definitely return you a healthy mother." At this point, even if Shen Yanma was still worried, he had to leave. But before he went out, he still asked Dao Tianchen for a promise. "You have to promise that you won't do anything bad to my mother." Dao Tianchen was not long-winded this time and agreed. Shen Yanma went out with a stomach full of doubts. The door of the hall was closed again. Dao Tianchen slowly walked to Ning Shuima. His fingers gently touched her face. "Arimo, after so many twists and turns, you are finally married to him. No wonder he disappeared." Chapter 1866. His voice was soft and gentle as he sighed. "I will save you. This time I will not let you go no matter what." He slightly closed his eyes. His long and slender jade-like fingers repeatedly waved in the air. Rays of purple light shot out from his fingertips and wrapped around Ning Shuima's body. The ice on Ning Shuima's body gradually melted. Slowly, her real body was revealed. She was still motionless and breathless. If it were not for her face, people would think that she was already dead. Dao Tianchen's gaze landed on her wound, and his gaze was faintly complicated. He sighed softly. "Mo, did you fight Mother Earth to the death? What a strong evil." He stretched out his palm and pressed it on her stomach. This time, a blue light appeared, and waves of light flickered from his palm, enveloping her whole body. The blue light flickered like the aurora borealis, creating an extremely magnificent and dazzling scene in the room. The wounds on Ning Shuima's body that could not be healed finally began to show signs of healing. They were sealing and disappearing little by little. After a long time, the hideous wounds on Ning Shuima's body finally disappeared. There was also a row of fine sweat on Dao Tianchen's forehead. Obviously, it consumed a lot of spiritual power to do this. When he saw that the wounds had disappeared, he heaved a sigh of relief. "Mo, you should wake up." He raised his hand and cast a spell on Ning Shuima's body. For a long time, there was no movement. Shen Yanma waited anxiously outside the door. The person had been treating his mother for 6 hours, but he still had not come out. There was no movement in the room at all. This made him very anxious. After waiting for another hour, he finally could not wait anymore. He was about to rush in to take a look. Suddenly, the door of the hall opened. "Mother, mother, wake up. Don't you want me anymore? Mother, I am scared. I can't live without you. Mother, do you want me to be an orphan? Mother, I am scared. Please come back." Shen Yinma lay on the bed and looked at his mother, who was lying on the bed. He called for her again and again. Every word was spoken in a sobbing tone, and they were all filled with fear. His mother's breathing and heartbeat had stopped. It was obvious that she had passed away. I don't know why her soul left her body, and her soul doesn't want to come back. I have searched the 6 realms with my secret technique, but I still can't find her soul. The only person who can bring her back may be you. You will be her only concern. So, Shen Yanma, you have to call her over and over again in her ears. The more miserable, the better. The more bitter, the better. If she doesn't wake up in 3 days, you'll lose her forever. This was what Dao Tianxin told Shen Yanma 2 days ago. At that time, Shen Yanma did not have the time to reprimand the man for not saving his mother immediately. Instead, he immediately followed the man's instructions. Unfortunately, his voice was almost hoarse from shouting, but his mother still did not move. She did not have the slightest intention of opening her eyes to look at him. It was already the 3rd day. If his mother didn't wake up today, he would really lose her again. He would become an orphan. Dao Tianxin sat at the table next to him and looked at Ning Xuema, who was lying on the bed. Where did her soul go? She was not in the 6 realms, but her soul was still there. What made her forget about her son and indulge in pleasure? Dao Tianxin had wandered around the hall more than 100 times. Chapter 1867. Dao Tianxin had wandered around the hall no less than 100 times. He had studied every brick and tile inside and out, but he still couldn't figure out what was so special about the hall. Although he felt that the hall was a little strange when he came in, he couldn't figure out what was strange after checking it out. Ning Xuemo really felt that the Almighty's stamina was amazing. She was tormented by him for 4 hours, which was 4 hours in modern times. The Almighty only wanted her once from the beginning to the end. This time it was midnight. With her stamina, she was so tired that she didn't even know when she fell asleep. She vaguely felt that Shinjuli had helped her clean her body. She vaguely felt that he was holding her in his arms. After that, she did not know anything else. When He Tian woke up, she slowly opened her eyes. The moment she opened her eyes, she was still a little nervous. She was afraid that she couldn't see him when she opened her eyes, or that she was floating in the air as a bystander. But when she saw everything around her, she was satisfied again. She was still lying on the embroidered bedding in his arms. Her arms were tightly wrapped around his waist. She looked up and saw his picturesque eyes. He was still sleeping. His eyes were slightly closed, and his black hair was scattered on the pillow. His thin lips were slightly pursed, and he looked unbelievably beautiful. She suddenly felt tears in her eyes. She had been entangled with him for so long, but she barely woke up in his arms. The last time he wanted her, he directly disappeared. This time, he was still there. He hugged her so tightly, as if she was the only treasure in his life. The sunlight shone in through the gaps in the curtains and danced on the floor, sprinkling a soft light. The light blue bed curtain was still hanging low. Outside the bed curtain was a screen that was painted by the Almighty himself. Every stroke was so beautiful. Ning Xuema didn't want to move. She opened her eyes and was in a daze for a while. Her dream was surprisingly long and surprisingly real. It was as if she had traveled back in time to 50,000 years ago, and to the Almighty's side. Here, he was still alive and had even achieved something good with her. She raised her head and looked at him quietly, using her gaze to trace his brows and eyes. She couldn't get enough of him. Time was so good that she couldn't bear to let go even a little bit. After watching for a while, she leaned her head back into his embrace and quietly listened to his steady heartbeat. For some reason, her eyes felt a little sour. She raised her hand and rubbed her eyes. Then, she stared at his hair and suddenly had a strange idea. She excitedly and carefully tied her hair with his. As husband and wife, they will never part even in old age. If he didn't wake up from this dream, or if she could bring him back, how great would that be? Thousands of thoughts rose and fell in her mind. In the end, she didn't want to think about anything. She closed her eyes again, intending to cultivate her drowsiness. I think you should look at me for a while longer. A magnetic and lazy voice came from above her head. Ning Shuimo raised her head and met his deep blue eyes. So you woke up a long time ago? You're so restless. How could I not wake up? Shunjili's lips seemed to have a smile. He raised her little face so that she could see him more clearly. I think that if you look at me from this angle, I would look the best. Ning Shuimo. This person's skin was really thick. Chapter 1868. How do you know that you look the best from this angle? Have you seen it yourself? She deliberately argued with him. God is omnipotent. Shunjili raised his hand and stroked her hair. He was deep in thought. You didn't shrink. Could it be that sleeping with me can really cure your chronic illness? This doesn't make sense. In fact, Ning Shuimo had already noticed this. Shunjili clearly said that his spell could only allow her to maintain the adult form for 4 hours. Now 12 hours had passed, but she was still the same. She secretly took out a mirror to take a look. It was actually her appearance after 50,000 years. In other words, it was Ning Shuimo's appearance. She had the face of a lowly and the body of a devil. This made her very satisfied. She felt that this was her body. Moreover, she felt very comfortable with Shunjili in this appearance. Her lips curled up into a smile. Suddenly, a shadow flashed in front of her eyes. He kissed her lips. His pleasant and magnetic voice sounded lazily. Are you still sleepy? His voice seemed to have a little hook, which made her heart tremble. He kissed her ear again. I feel that the medicine on your body hasn't been cured yet. Ning Shuimo was speechless. He was craving for more after tasting it. However, his physical strength was too terrifying. Moreover, it was her first time, so it should still be painful. She remembered that she was in pain for a few days when he raped her. She quickly pushed him away. No, it's still painful. He held her in his arms and raised his eyebrows. It's still painful? Are you sure? Of course. No, it didn't hurt at all. Apart from the soreness on her body, she couldn't feel anything else. She was surprised. Suddenly, she had an idea. You used medicine on me? Only his medicine could be so perverted. Shunjili grunted and turned over to press her under his body. His voice was muffled. Don't waste my medicine. The temperature in the gauze curtain rose again. The curtain that was just opened was put back again. The shadows in the curtain rose and fell. Ning Shuimo fell asleep again. This time, she slept all the way until evening. In her dreams, she vaguely heard him whisper in her ear, Am I dreaming? Shuimo, Shuimo. Her response was to snuggle deeper into his embrace and call out to him in a muffled voice, Guru. Shunjili tightened his arms around her and looked down at her. What did you call me? Ning Shuimo didn't say anything and fell into a deep sleep. When Ning Shuimo woke up again, it was already evening. Outside, there were thousands of rays of multicolored light, spreading across the horizon like satin. A chill ran down her spine. This was the scenery she was used to seeing when she stayed in the side hall of Fantion Palace. The sunset was infinitely beautiful, and she enjoyed it alone. In the Fantion Palace, she had seen such a scene countless times. Every time, she would hug her knees and watch by herself without anyone accompanying her. Was she back again? She looked around anxiously. There was a thick screen and a light blue bed curtain. Everything was so familiar. It was the same scenery she saw in the side hall. Her heart suddenly sank. It seemed that she had woken up from the dream. She moved her body in the quilt. Her body was still sore and soft. Could it be that a wet dream could make her feel like this? Oh right, where was Nienma? She remembered that she rushed back but fainted in front of little Nienma. Then, she had the long dream. Chapter 1869. Was the child frightened? Was he the one who dragged her to this side hall? She looked around again. The hall was still the same, but the decorations were much more exquisite. For example, the screen, the incense tripod on the table, and the vase on the table. There was even a plum blossom in the vase to add some liveliness to the hall. The decorations in the hall were simple and elegant, giving people a sense of peace. She got out of bed and looked down again. She found that she had changed into a new dress. It was as red as the morning sun, and the style was fitting. It fluttered as she walked. She did not remember that she had such a dress. Where did little Nienma find it? She was curious, so she checked her body again. Her heart skipped a beat. She had changed all her undergarments. Even her underwear was no exception. Her lips twitched. Little Nienma could not have changed her so thoroughly. Could he? Could it be that he had other reinforcements? Was it a fairy from the celestial kingdom? She could not figure it out. She moved her arms and legs, and the wounds were all gone. She did not feel anything except for a kind of lazy soreness. Where did Nienma go? She had just fainted in front of him. Did that scare him? She opened the door and walked out. Everything was so familiar that it couldn't be any more familiar. There was a bamboo forest on the left side of the hall, and a colorful lake on the right side. There were swaying trees planted by the lake, and the wide leaves swayed in the wind. Ning Xuema looked at the swaying trees for a moment and suddenly felt that the tree seemed to be thinner. She rubbed her eyes again. Perhaps it was an illusion. The swaying trees were famous in ancient times. Other trees would have a growth ring in a year, but it only had one growth ring every 3,000 years. This growth speed was shockingly slow. A few thousand years was not much, but its life was very long. This kind of tree only grew in the Fantian Palace. Little Nienma inadvertently told her about the growth characteristics of this tree. Needless to say, this knowledge was taught to him by his father. Thinking of Shinjuli, she felt like her heart was being pricked by needles. That person had completely disappeared. He had disappeared from this world. Gods and demons could not coexist. Gods and demons loving each other was against the will of the heavens. Only one of them could live, and he chose to sacrifice himself, leaving her to spend the long night alone. The future was still so long. So long. It was so long that no end could be seen. But she couldn't see any real hope. She closed her eyes slightly and turned around to look at the side palace where she lived. He had slept in this side chamber for 2 nights, and both times he had dreamt of things that happened 50,000 years ago. What was so strange about this hall? Or did it have some kind of strange magnetic field, allowing people to enter this dream? Her gaze suddenly fell on the 2 stone sculptures in front of the main hall, and she was stunned. She was no stranger to these 2 stone sculptures. They were Cheongqi and Tengxi. Strangely, were they not awakened by little Nienma? Why are you pretending to be a stone statue again? Could it be that little Nienma was worried about her being alone in the hall, so he sent the 2 mythological beasts to guard the door for her? That was possible. That little fellow was actually quite attentive and considerate. She missed her son and wanted to find him. Before she walked out of the courtyard, she suddenly heard a melodious sound of the guqin. Her body suddenly stiffened. The sound, it was something that only Shinjuli could play. Almost without hesitation, she rushed in the direction of the sound of the guqin. Chapter 1870. The Hawksbill Turtle Pavilion was built on top of a cliff and had an antique feel to it. Although it was called a cliff, it was actually a skyscraper. It was more than 1,000 meters high and slippery all around. Even apes could not climb up. Of course, the people in the Fantian Palace could fly. Everyone in the Stone Palace could go up, but in the Fantian Palace, no one dared to climb except for the Divine Master. The 8 mythological beasts said that it was a forbidden area set up by the Divine Master. Only the Divine Master could go up. Ning Xuema did not care about that. In order to find the clues left by Shinjuli, she had even gone up this forbidden area several times. However, other than the lone pavilion, there was nothing special about it. And now, the sound of the guqin was coming from that pavilion. Ning Xuema stood at the foot of the mountain and felt that her legs were a little weak. Could it be him up there? Could it be? The sound of the guqin sounded like it was played by him, but he had disappeared. How could he appear again? Unless it was a dream, however. She had already woken up from that dream. This was living reality. She could know the result if she flew up, but she felt that her legs were very heavy and she could not lift them up. She stood at the foot of the mountain and listened to the sound of the guqin in a daze. She did not know what she was thinking. She did not know how long she stood there. Even when the sound of the guqin stopped, she still could not go up. The sound of the guqin curled up and stopped, but the sound was still lingering in her ears. The surroundings were silent, as if the sound of the guqin had never appeared. She sighed. Was she hallucinating? Was she? Although she thought so, she did not give up. She flew up and went straight to the peak of the mountain. The moment she flew up and stood at the edge of the peak, she felt as if a big stone had hit her heart. The pavilion was still the same, but there was a circle of snow-white floating gauze around the pavilion. It fluttered with the mountain wind and swayed like clouds. In the gazebo sat a man in white. His wide white robe was fluttering in the wind. A guqin was placed on the table in front of him. He casually rested his elbow on the table and looked at her with a smile that was not a smile. "You're finally willing to come up? Almighty!" Ning Shuima's body swayed and she staggered. She almost fell off the big rock. A white veil flew out like a waterfall and wrapped around her slender waist. In a blink of an eye, she had already flown into the gazebo. She landed in his arms. A familiar aura, a familiar person. Ning Shuima's entire body stiffened as she stared blankly at him. Was this a dream or a real person? She wasn't dreaming, was she? Are you stupid? Shinjili put her on his lap and looked at her face for a moment. He touched her forehead with the back of his hand. You don't have a fever. Is it the side effect of the medicine? Ning Shuima felt as if she had been doused with a basin of water. She instantly came to her senses. So this was still a dream, and it was a dream from 50,000 years ago. She seemed to be disappointed and relieved at the same time. She raised her hand and hugged his neck, murmuring, "Your Fantion Palace hasn't changed for tens of thousands of years, right? Sure enough, time doesn't leave a trace." Shinjili raised his eyebrows and looked at her. "Why are you so emotional? Have you entered my Fantion Palace before?" "I entered it 50,000 years later. It was almost the same as now. I can't tell which is a dream and which is reality." Ning Shuima rubbed her eyebrows. She felt a little confused. Chapter 1871. Why are you in such a daze? Have you lost your soul? Shinjili placed his hand on her wrist to check on her body. Ning Shuima smiled. Suddenly, she lifted her head and kissed him on his chin. "I am a little tired. It's okay. I will be fine after some rest." A little tired, Shinjili looked at her with a subtle gaze. Under his gaze, Ning Shuima nearly burst into flames. She jumped off his lap and sat in front of him. "Why did you suddenly come here to play the zither?" She thought that she had already woken up from her wet dream. "The music is good for your recovery," Shinjili answered. "Then you should have stayed in the hall and played for me alone. You should not have come so far away. By the way, why did you move me to the Snow Appreciation Hall when I was asleep?" The name of the side hall that she slept in was the Snow Appreciation Hall. Shinjili raised his eyebrows. "Snow Appreciation Hall?" Ning Shuima's heart skipped a beat. When she looked back at the hall, there seemed to be an inconspicuous plaque. There were a few big words on the plaque that she did not recognize. Nianma once told her that it was the Snow Appreciation Hall, so she always thought that it was the Snow Appreciation Hall. She was a little absent-minded earlier, so she did not look at the words carefully. Now that she thought about it, it seemed that the strokes of the words were indeed different from what she saw 50,000 years later. Shinjili seemed to have thought of something. He looked at her from head to toe and teased her. "Snow Appreciation Hall. This name is not bad. It fits the mood and the scenery. From now on, the hall will be called the Snow Appreciation Hall." Ning Shuima was speechless. He was teasing her again. Suddenly, her heart skipped a beat. Was this the origin of the name of the Snow Appreciation Hall? Was she the one who named the hall? Ning Shuima decided not to think about it for the time being. She looked around and asked, "Why do you like to play the guqin here?" She did not feel that there was anything special about the mountain. "Quiet," Shinjili answered lazily. Ning Shuima looked at him and felt a little wronged. They had just consummated their marriage last night, and he had tormented her enough. Usually, when a girl woke up in such a situation, shouldn't her husband prepare some nutritional supplements? However, he moved her to the back of a side hall and left her there alone, while he ran over here to play the guqin in a carefree manner. The Almighty was indeed the Almighty. He didn't know how to dote on others. She didn't say anything. She stood up and walked around the mountain peak. Soon, she discovered that there was something different about the mountain peak. This mountain peak wasn't too high, but standing on top of it, one could overlook all the living beings in the world. To be able to look down on the other 35 heavens. At the corner of the mountain, there was a snow-white boulder. The boulder was flickering with fluorescent light, as if thousands of rays of light were gathering on it. Ning Shuima only glanced at it a few times before she felt her heart beating wildly, and she felt a little dizzy. Looking at the boulder was not comfortable, but she seemed to be addicted to it. She couldn't help but look at it again and again. She seemed to see countless characters flying around on the boulder. She wanted to see them more clearly, but those characters seemed to be covered by a layer of gauze, so she couldn't see them clearly. She took a few steps forward, hoping to see them more clearly. But unexpectedly, his head suddenly became dizzy, and he staggered backwards. However, she didn't fall to the ground. Instead, she fell into a faint embrace. "Don't look at that," Shinjili whispered in her ear. He carried her back to the gazebo and sat down. "What is this boulder for?" Ning Shuima was puzzled. She had come to this mountain more than once 50,000 years later, but she had never seen this boulder. Chapter 1872. Sky Mirror Stone. Shinjili answered with 3 words, "All right, let's not bother about this stone. Are you hungry?" Ning Shuima's stomach actually grumbled when he asked. Shinjili chuckled, "You are indeed hungry." Ning Shuima blushed and looked at him provocatively. "So what if I'm hungry? Can you cook a good meal for me here?" Shinjili held his chin and looked at her with a faint smile. Shouldn't the wife be the one to cook? The word wife pleased her. Ning Shuima squinted her eyes like a crescent moon. "I'm not your wife yet, am I? We haven't gotten married yet." Shinjili played with a strand of her hair. "You want a ceremony?" Ning Shuima raised her eyebrows. "Of course. You have to know that a woman's wedding day is the day that she looks forward to the most." "All right, then I'll give you a ceremony." "What kind of ceremony do you want?" Although she knew that this was a dream, Ning Shuima still said what she looked forward to the most. For example, a road paved with flowers, a bridal sedan. She said all the wedding methods that she could imagine in one breath. She even accidentally said the wedding dress. Shinjili listened and rubbed her head. "You have a rich imagination. All right, I'll give you a wedding like this in the future and let you be completely satisfied for once." Ning Shuima smiled, but she felt a little bitter in her heart. This was a dream after all, a golden millet pillow. When she woke up from this dream, his gentleness and promise would disappear with the wind. The sun finally set and night fell. When night fell, Ning Shuima finally realized that this mountain was different from the rest. The stars in the sky were floating below the mountain. She stood on the mountain peak and looked down. What she saw was a spectacular Milky Way. Thousands of stars were floating below, like a river full of stars. The beauty of the scenery could not be found anywhere else. Shinjili began to play the guqin again. The sound of the guqin drifted around the mountain peak, and even the stars at the foot of the mountain seemed to move along with the sound of the guqin. Ning Shuima rubbed her rumbling stomach. This devil lord had obviously learned the art of Anidia. Even if she didn't eat for a year, it wouldn't matter. How could she feel hungry after she possessed her body? Was this really still a dream? Shinjili was also strange. When he asked her if she was hungry, she thought that he would prepare a table of delicious food for her. However, he seemed to have forgotten about it after he asked. Now he was playing the piano again. Just as she was feeling a little resentful, she suddenly heard a pa sound. A fish fell from the sky and landed right next to her feet, giving her a fright. The fish was golden all over and wasn't small in size. It opened its mouth and puffed up its cheeks as it hopped around with all its might. Fish actually fell from the sky. Ning Shuima was even more excited than a pie falling from the sky. She grabbed the fish and beamed with joy. "Jolie, how about I roast a fish for you?" Shin Jili raised his eyebrows and looked at her. He obviously didn't believe her. "The fish you roast? Is it edible?" Ning Shuima was proud. "I've been away for 3 days. Of course, I have to look at you with new eyes. I'll cook it for you now." She had learned how to cook in the real world so that she could make a good meal for him when he returned. Now that she could show off her skills, she naturally didn't want to miss it. "I'm looking forward to it," Shin Jili replied her with 2 words. Ning Shuima immediately cooked the fish. She was the devil lord. No matter what kind of utensils it was, she could easily make them appear. Shin Jili watched her busy at the side, and his eyes flashed. Ning Shuima cooked the fish very quickly. After a while, a plate of braised fish was already out of the pot. She handed him a pair of chopsticks. "Come, try it." Chapter 1873. Shin Jili took the chopsticks and tasted it. It tasted pretty good. He couldn't help but look at her again and again. Ning Shuima was gorging herself while looking at him proudly. "How is it?" "Not bad." Shin Jili gave a fair evaluation. This great god didn't praise people easily. She remembered that she had mastered a spell that took others 2 years to master in a month. In the end, when she went to show off in front of him, he only gave her a not bad evaluation, which was quite a blow to her. Therefore, it was not easy to get a not bad from him now. Shin Jili was still looking at her. Ning Shuima was a little scared by his stare. "Why are you looking at me like that? There's no flower on my face." Shin Jili smiled leisurely. "You look like a flower. It's like you're a different person." Ning Shuima's heart skipped a beat. Although little Shuima was her past, she was still ignorant at that time. She was still a child in terms of thinking. Unlike now, she had the memories of 3 lives and had experienced too many joys and sorrows. She had been rolling in the mortal world for so many years. Whether it was her mentality or her personality, it was actually very different from before. It was like she was a different person. She tilted her head and looked at him. "Then which one do you like?" Shin Jili raised his eyebrows and looked at her. "What do you mean, which one? Didn't you say that I'm like a different person? Do you like the current me or the previous me?" Shin Jili raised his hand and rubbed her face. "Whether it's the current you or the previous you, isn't it still you?" That was true. Ning Shuima ate half of the fish but was still not full. She looked up at the sky again. Why didn't the fish come down? But this fish was really delicious. Even with her half-baked culinary skills, the food was still delicious. After eating, she felt that her strength had increased a lot. Even the soreness from before was gone. Needless to say, it was Shin Jili's credit that fish could fall from the sky. Ning Shuima hugged one of his arms and said, "Jili, why don't you let God drop a few more fish? This is the heavenly river fish. It takes 1,000 years to grow to this size. If a mortal eats it, they can extend their lifespan by 1,000 years. If an immortal eats it, they can rapidly increase their power, break through bottlenecks, and quickly level up. Even the Celestial Emperor once asked me for a fish like this and offered countless peaches in exchange for it. But I didn't give it to him." Shin Jili said leisurely, "Do you really eat it like an ordinary river fish?" It turned out that this fish was so expensive. Ning Shuima sighed. "Forget it. I was gonna steam another one for you." She wished she could show off her cooking skills in front of him and let him praise her. Shin Jili glanced at her and didn't say anything. Instead, he played a few notes on the zither. After a while, 3 more fish fell from the sky. They were even bigger than the previous one. Shin Jili ordered slowly, "I want 1 steamed, 1 fried, and 1 stewed." His eyes were full of expectation. "Can you make all of them?" His request was a little too much. Ning Shuima had already learned 2 cooking methods. However, it was just cooking. She could learn by analogy. She could try to explore the other aspects. She started to roll up her sleeves. Her eyes were shining. I can try. Try? Shun Jili waved his sleeves and took away 2 big fish, leaving only the smallest one for her. Try that one. Ning Shuima stared at the 2 fish in his hands. She was unwilling to give up. Let go of these 2? I'll cook these 2 fishes, Shinjili said slowly as he cooked the 2 fishes. The 2 of them had suffered for so long. It was time to write about their sweet daily life. Of course, there was also a hidden plot. In fact, careful readers should be able to see that what Shuima thought was a dream was actually not a dream. You asked me what it was exactly? That was a secret. Ha ha ha, it will be revealed later. Chapter 1874. Ning Shuima's competitive spirit was aroused. How about we have a competition? Let's see who cooks the best. With the first successful fish as the foundation, Ning Shuima gained some confidence. Shin Jili looked at her and said, okay. He then added, utensils can be made at will, but seasonings can't be used. Huh? Ning Shuima widened her eyes. Why? Wasn't he trying to make things difficult for her? Who would carry a bag of seasonings with him? She didn't even have any salt. She couldn't just boil it in plain water, right? Seasonings made with spells will hinder the effect of the fish. You have to use natural seasonings. Shin Jili explained to her as he slowly took out all kinds of seasonings from his body. He placed the bottles and cans in a row as if he was lining up. Regardless of whether it was the previous life or the future, some deep-rooted habits could not be changed. For example, the Almighty's obsession with cleanliness. He always placed things neatly, as if he was inspecting an army. Ning Shuima looked at the bottles and cans. She couldn't help but think of the medicine bottles left in his bedroom. They were also arranged in the same way. It was a pity that she would never see him again in the real world. Now, it was nothing more than an illusion in a dream. She felt sour in her heart. She was handling the fish scales and accidentally cut her hand. Blood came out. She was about to deal with it herself when a hand reached out, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her up. Why are you so careless? Shun Jili glanced at the cut on her hand and helped her to deal with it. His hand was warm and dry, just like the temperature in her memory. The strength he used to hold her hand was just right. It wouldn't hurt her, and he handled it very cleanly. Ning Shuima lowered her head to look at his busy appearance. Her eyes suddenly felt bitter and sour. Such a small wound was a piece of cake for Shin Jili. In just a few moments, the bleeding had stopped, and the wound had healed quickly. He looked up and saw her watery eyes. The corners of her eyes were red. He was startled. What's wrong? Why are you crying? Ning Shuima threw herself into his arms and hugged his waist. She could feel his warmth and his breath. It was so warm, so nice, so real. These were all things that she could no longer feel in real life. The bitterness in her heart intensified, and she hugged him even tighter. If it was possible, she really wanted to kidnap him out of this dream and into reality so that the 3 of them could stay together forever. Shin Jili placed his hand on her head and rubbed it. Then, he forcefully pulled her out of his arms and looked into her eyes. What's wrong with you? Ning Shuima wiped her eyes. Nothing. She said it was nothing, but she couldn't stop her tears. If only this was true. If only he was really by her side. Shin Jili looked at her, who was crying like a baby, and laughed. Is it because there is no seasoning? How about I lend you my seasoning as well? As he spoke, he raised his hand to wipe her tears. Although you have grown up, your crybaby habit hasn't changed at all. Ning Shuima knew how little Shuima was like in front of Shin Jili when she was a child. When she was punished or couldn't get something she wanted, she would use crying to torture him. Shin Jili often didn't fall for her tricks. He often watched her cry leisurely. Occasionally, he would say, "Cry. It looks better when you cry. Your tears should fall in pairs to make it more beautiful." Chapter 1875. Every time he said something like that, She would get angry and her tears would disappear in an instant. She hated him for being so hard-hearted. Her tears had always been invincible, but when it came to him, it was so easy to hit an iron plate. However, whenever she cried badly, Shinjuli did not seem to care. He even laughed at her, but in the end, he would always fulfill her request and say, "You look good when you cry. It will be great in the future." Ning Xuema suddenly realized that she seemed to have merged with little Xuema's memory. Originally, she only saw some scenes of little Xuema and Shinjuli in her dream. There was no scene of him saying those words when she cried. Now, it automatically appeared in her mind, just like her original memory. Was it really a dream? Then this dream was a little too long. Could it be that she had transmigrated to 50,000 years ago? Would she be able to go back again? She originally traveled to this world, so it was not a big deal to travel again. But what about little Nianma? Was she dead in the other world? Little Nianma had already lost his father. If he lost his mother as well, she did not know how he would cry. Ning Xuema's heart ached. She was most sorry for the child. She did not take good care of him. Also, although she did not know what happened 50,000 years ago, she knew the final ending. The ending of little Xuema and Shinjuli was not good. Little Xuema jumped into the purple evil spirit and became a sacrifice, while Shinjuli left the celestial devil continent and went to the Tianxi continent. There, he met her reincarnation. She frowned as she sat in his arms, her thoughts drifting off to God knows where. Shinjuli looked at her quietly. He did not disturb her. He held her in his arms with one hand, and the other hand was busy cooking. Ning Xuema was awakened by a very good smell of food. Her eyes fell on the slightly golden fish that was roasted. The aroma was so good that it could steal people's souls. She could not help but swallow her saliva. You have roasted one. It was too fragrant. It was simply too fragrant. Ning Xuema felt that she had never smelled such a delicious grilled fish in her life. If it smelled so good, then it would definitely be a delicacy. Shinjuli calmly turned the fish over again and answered her. You were lost in thought for too long. She didn't. She was lost in thought for a quarter of an hour at most. Ning Xuemo remembered that she hadn't cooked the fish yet. She quickly jumped out of his arms and said, I haven't cooked the fish yet. As she quickly processed the fish in her hand, she looked at the fish in his hand that was almost done grilling and asked, Can we exchange later? Why don't you taste mine and I'll taste yours? Shinjuli sprinkled the last layer of seasoning on the fish. We'll talk about it when you're done. How stingy. He was afraid that she wouldn't be able to cook well, so he would be at a disadvantage if they exchanged, right? This person really didn't want to be at a disadvantage no matter when or where. Ning Xuema pursed her lips and steamed the fish. Since she knew how precious the fish was, Ning Xuema naturally did not want to waste it. She was very attentive and focused on cooking. Shinjuli had unknowingly squatted beside her. He watched her work and said casually, Your cooking skills have improved a lot. I remember that you were very stupid in this area. He really knew how to tell the truth. He wasn't afraid of hurting her self-confidence. Ning Xuemo replied, Hard work can make up for it. Chapter 1876. Ning Xuemo replied, Diligence makes up for stupidity. Before she could finish her sentence, a piece of fish appeared in her mouth. The fresh and fragrant taste filled her mouth, making her want to swallow her tongue. She had wanted to have a backbone and not eat his fish, but since it was so delicious, then she would reluctantly eat it. When did you learn to cook? A long time later. Ning Xuema wanted to answer him like this, but he would definitely not believe it. So Ning Xuema answered in a proper way, not long ago. For her in reality, she did learn to cook a few days ago, and she did not lie. You are a promising child. Shinjili praised her and stuffed a piece of fish into her mouth. Ning Xuema was squatting there, and suddenly there was a brocade stool under her butt, which made her sit very comfortably. Shinjili also sat next to her on the same brocade stool. While talking to her, he stuffed fish into her mouth. Ning Xuema, who was eating delicious food, was very easy to talk to. Her eyebrows and eyes were curved, and she answered almost all of his questions. Did you know Luo Juchen before? Shen Jili asked casually. No. Ning Xuema blinked. Even in her dream, it was the first time she saw him. Okay? Shen Jili's eyes flashed with a touch of deep thought. Ning Xuema's heart moved. In fact, she also wanted to ask about Luo Juchen's origin. You seem to be very familiar with that bastard. What does he do? He drugged me as soon as we met. Shen Jili's fingers carelessly handed her some handy tools, and he answered carelessly. He has bad intentions. You should stay away from him in the future. Who is he? Ning Xuema did not give up. Shen Jili stuffed a piece of fish into her mouth and blocked her mouth. Just an idler. Ning Xuema. She still wanted to say something, but Shen Jili clapped his hands. Well, I have given you all the fish. Is yours cooked? Ning Xuema looked at the big fish bone in his hand. It was a complete fish skeleton, and there was not a single piece of meat left. It turned out that he had unknowingly fed her all the grilled fish. This person's cooking skills were not for show. Compared to him, her cooking skills, which she had painstakingly practiced cooking skills, were at most passable. Her steamed fish was out of the pot, and the taste could only be said to be passable. Shen Jili sat there and tasted the food. She asked him unconfidently, "Is it good?" Shen Jili ate elegantly and calmly, and answered her, "It's still edible." It was edible. Even the dogs would not like to smell the food that she had cooked. With such an interruption, Ning Xuema forgot to ask about Luo Juchen. After eating and drinking, Ning Xuema was very satisfied. She felt that this was the life that only gods could live. The only flaw was that she could not bring little Nianma over and let him taste the precious fish. The little guy was still growing, so eating this would be very beneficial for him. Unfortunately, this was only a dream. She could not bring everything back from the dream. Nianma, sigh, Nianma. Mother, Nianma misses you. Don't leave Nianma alone. She vaguely heard a call in her ear. The voice was very far away and very vague, but it made her heart tremble. Her body stiffened. What's wrong? Shen Jili was holding her and looking at the stars. He was keenly aware of her abnormality. Chapter 1877. What's wrong? Shen Jili was holding her and looking at the stars. He was keenly aware of her abnormality. Did you hear anything? Ning Xuema asked with uncertainty. Shen Jili looked at her and asked, "What did you hear?" Little Nianma's voice. Ning Xuema answered casually. Nianma? Shen Jili raised his eyebrows and looked at her. Who is he? He is your son after 50,000 years. Ning Xuema wanted to say so, but she could not say it. She paused for a moment and tilted her head to listen again, but she couldn't hear any calls. Perhaps she was hallucinating. Ning Xuema looked at Shen Jili and suddenly had an idea. If she tried to tell him the truth, how would he react? However, even if she wanted to ask, she had to ask in a roundabout way. Jili, do you think I have changed a lot recently? Shen Jili looked at her and said, It is as if you have changed into a different person. After her body grew bigger, her personality was also very different from before. Shen Jili did not suspect that she was possessed by someone else. He had secretly checked her soul several times, but the soul inside was indeed her and not some wandering spirit. What was more strange was that he was actually used to her changed personality. It was as if she was supposed to be like this when she grew up. He also liked her personality when she grew up. When she was young, although his feelings for her were different, he only treated her as a child and did not have any improper thoughts about her. When she was poisoned, he even wanted to use a special method to detoxify her by consuming half of his spiritual power. He did not intend to use the most direct and simplest method. It wasn't until she became a completely different person and started to cling onto his body that his mentality suddenly changed. That was the reason why he was able to detoxify her last night. He looked at her beside him. She looked up at him with a pair of watery eyes. Her little face seemed to be stained with the glow of the sunset. He did not know why, but he suddenly remembered how she was under him last night. Suddenly, his throat tightened. and his eyes gradually darkened. Ning Shuama did not know that she had been targeted by the wolf. She hugged his arm and tried to beat around the bush. Then, do you feel that I have matured? Shun Jili looked at her for a moment and his eyes darkened. You have indeed matured. Have you never suspected that I was possessed? Ning Shuama finally gathered the courage to ask. Your soul is in your body, Shun Jili answered. His eyes looked at her was even more unpredictable. It turned out that he had already examined her soul body. It seemed that he was indeed suspicious. Ning Shuama didn't know if it was because she was relieved or if it was because of something else. But when she lifted her head, she forgot that she was sitting in his embrace. The two of them were so close that when she lifted her head, it was just enough for her lips to meet his. Her red lips touched his thin lips. Her heart skipped a beat. She was about to lean back and move away from him, but he pressed her head down and kissed her lips forcefully. Oh, She wanted to say something else, but when she opened her mouth, his lips and tongue had already begun to invade her. Her heart was beating like thunder, and her head was buzzing. Focus, he whispered softly beside her lips. His movements were forceful and gentle, so she could not say another word. His movements could be said to be calm and composed, but it was incomparably forceful. The tip of his tongue opened her teeth and accurately searched for her tongue, forcing it to dance with him. He did not give her any room to retreat. Chapter 1878. She wanted to struggle, but her hands were firmly held by him. She was in his arms, so she had no choice but to let him do whatever he wanted. She originally thought that he just wanted a kiss from her, but she didn't expect him to fall to the ground while hugging and kissing her. In that instant, Ning Shuama understood what he wanted to do. The moment she was pressed down by him, her heart was startled. Although the scenery here was magnificent, the ground beneath her feet was made of solid bluestone. Moreover, it was bumpy. If she fell on it, she was afraid that her back would be ground to mush before she could finish worrying. Her body had already landed on a soft blanket. This person was really well prepared. He even prepared a blanket. But they were outside. Okay? She pushed him away and blushed like an apple. We can't do it here, don't worry. There's only you and me here. No one else, but no buts. Be good. There's still poison in your body. Ning Shuama didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She didn't have any poison left in her body. Okay? He was the one with the poison in his body, wasn't he? No, he couldn't say that there was still poison in his body, but he was addicted to it. It turned out that this divine master was also like this when he had a taste. The stars around the peak rose and fell. The wind blew the white veil at the corner of the pavilion. The world was peaceful, and he and she were very harmonious. It was not an ordinary harmony. She couldn't deny that this Almighty was very studious. When he made love with her for the first time, his movements were a little stiff and painful. But now, the Almighty was a professional player. This lasted for a long time. Ning Shuama felt that the fish she ate had been used up by this exercise. Time passed, and it was already the latter half of the night. Ning Shuama was so tired that she lay on the blanket and couldn't get up. Shin Jili, on the other hand, was calm and composed. He was cleaning her up and applying medicine on her wounds. When he was cleaning a certain part of her body, the shyness that she felt when she ran away from home suddenly returned. She could not help but block it. He looked at her hand gesture and guessed, "Do you want more? Want your sister?" Ning Shuama opened her eyes and tried to get up. I'll do it myself. However, the moment he moved, he felt as if his entire body was falling apart. He didn't want to move at all. We're already like this. Why are you still shy? Shin Jili found it strange. Any woman would be shy, all right? Ning Shuama thought that she had a thorough understanding of the Almighty, but now she realized that she only knew the surface. Once this supreme divinity decided to act shamelessly, it could completely change her worldview. She turned to look at him. His robes were already neat and tidy, and his celestial aura was floating. He still looked untainted by the mortal world. Looking back at himself, He was just like the saying in a dream of the Red Chamber. Naked and without any worries. Fortunately, he had already cleaned her up. Ning Shuima grabbed the clothes next to her and put them on. Shun Jili sat at the side and watched her busy herself. When she was dressed, he waved to her and said, "Come here." How would Ning Shuima dare to go over? She looked at him cautiously. "What are you doing?" She didn't want to come again. If she came again, she wouldn't be able to leave this mountain. She was afraid that he would cast a spell to pull her over again. She even took a few steps back and rejected him sternly. "I don't want to come again." Chapter 1879. Shun Jili raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I just want to give you a massage to loosen your muscles and bones. What are you thinking?" Ning Shuima was speechless. Shun Jili sighed. "I didn't expect you to be impure so soon." Ning Shuima had the urge to bite him. Damn it! He had been flirting with her all along. Why did he label her as an impure person? She never thought that Shun Jili would have such a wicked taste after his first taste. Even when he was with Shui Yimo, he did not seem to be like this. At that time, he was more fond of Shui Yimo. Perhaps, he already knew that she came with a purpose, so his eyes were always flashing with deep thoughts. As for the time when little Nianma was with her, she miserably had sex with him once. After that, he disappeared, and later he violently punished her. Unlike this time, she did not know that he could be so evil. This kind of him made her feel a little strange, so she moved her butt back again. "What are you afraid of?" Shun Jili sat there and looked at her. His tone was very patient. "Are you afraid that I will eat you up?" Damn it! He had already eaten her 3 times today. Alright? The reason why she was still so lively was all because of her good health. "Come here. I will make you very comfortable." Shun Jili sat there solemnly. His words were like the big bad wolf who was tempting Little Red Riding Hood, but his tone was very serious. Ning Shuima wanted to cry but had no tears. His words could easily lead people astray. Shun Jili's fingers tapped on the futon under him. He looked like he was about to laugh. "Shuima, if I want to do anything to you, even if you are 800 feet away from me, I can still make you throw yourself into my arms in an instant." This sentence was indeed true. Ning Shuima certainly knew what he was capable of. He could indeed do this with just a few gestures. Thus, she sat in front of him and turned her back to him. "Alright, since you're still sincere, I'll let you serve me this time." Shun Jili smiled. Naturally, he didn't want to argue with her anymore. His massage technique was very professional, and he also used a spell during the massage. Therefore, the soreness in Ning Shuima's body disappeared like snow melting away. Moreover, his actions were very proper and he didn't take advantage of her at all. Ning Shuima finally breathed a sigh of relief. After such a torment, she had forgotten what she wanted to say earlier. The night breeze was getting colder. Ning Shuima subconsciously leaned into his arms and sighed. Everything is just like a dream. If only this was not a dream. If only she could bring little Nianma here, then she would be satisfied. The two of them snuggled together and looked at the flowing river of stars and the overlapping sun and moon outside. Shun Jili seemed to have thought of something. "Let's pick a date and have the wedding." Although he didn't care about the ceremony, since she liked it, he would do it as soon as possible. Ning Shuima's heart skipped a beat. She could not help but ask, Do you really want to marry me?" Shun Jili raised his eyebrows. "Don't you want to marry me? You even brought a lot of dowry. Do you want me to show you the proposal letter?" Ning Shuima coughed. "That thing, didn't you burn it?" "Well, I wanted to burn it, but it was not easy to ignite it. So I threw it into the storage space." Shun Jili pinched his fingertips, and a red invitation letter appeared in his palm. "Do you want me to read it to you?" Ning Shuima coughed. Since she already had little Shuima's memory, she naturally knew what was written on the invitation letter. Chapter 1880. "Jili, you and I love each other, so we are doing good for the people. Marry me and be my husband. I have countless jewels as my dowry." She was so straightforward that it made people's hair stand on end. Jili stretched out his finger and knocked on her head. I have taught you for a few years, and you still learn to be like this. You are a disgrace to me. When he first saw the post, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He had the impulse to pull her over and slap the post on her face. Ning Xuema understood that the reason why little Xuema was like that was because of the environment. Jili only came once every 10 days or half a month to teach her. Each time he came, the time was limited. He just let her memorize books. She memorized a lot of books, but after all, she was in the demon realm and the devil realm. There were few people in the demon realm and the devil realm who were literate. Everyone was generally very straightforward. Little Xuema grew up in that kind of environment. Gradually, she developed a temperament where she would use her fists to subdue others. In addition, after she entered the devil realm, she had not seen Jili for nearly 1,000 years. Thus, she had long forgotten all the literary words that he taught her. Therefore, when she proposed to Jili, she wrote such a straightforward letter. Even the words were written in a threatening manner. Jili sighed when he read it. Every time he saw her, he had the urge to drag her to his side and make her his woman again. Straightforward, naive, reckless, but her strength was off the charts. When she smiled, her eyelashes curved like an angel. When she cried, her tears rolled down in pairs, making people want to hold her in their arms and pamper her. This was the feeling that little Xuema gave people. Jili had lived for too long and was too bored. He had saved many people or things, and even brought back the particularly clever ones to teach for a few days. However, he had never been very patient with this. No matter how smart and clever a spiritual pet was, after raising it for a while, he would let it go again, or let it choose another master. Of course, he had adopted more spiritual pets, but it was the first time he had raised a demon. He was the master of the 6 realms, so the devil realm was naturally under his jurisdiction. Naturally, he would not look down on the devil realm. However, it was still very refreshing for him to personally teach a devil that was born from the heavens and earth. For the first time, after teaching her for so many years, he actually didn't get tired of teaching her. After she ran off to the devil world to conquer the world, although he no longer went to see her, he still paid attention to her news from time to time. He knew that with her ability, she wouldn't suffer any losses. Later on, when she became the devil master, he even had the feeling that the child he taught had finally grown up and become a talent. As for her sudden proposal letter, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he naturally ignored it. He did not think that he would want to marry a child. What's more, her method of marriage proposal was so strange that he would never agree to it. But even if he didn't agree, he still treated her differently. He still cared about her and paid attention to her movements. He even kept looking for ways to make her grow up completely. Originally, he had never thought of taking her as his wife, but from a certain point last night, it was as if he had changed his nature. The thought of wanting her was howling in his chest, and he wanted to keep her by his side forever. Since he wanted her and could also cure her poison, he naturally went with the flow. He was not an irresponsible person. When he and she were having sex, he had already made up his mind to marry her. Now that he mentioned it, he casually pinched her little face. In a few days, I will draft a marriage proposal letter and send it to your Mo palace to prepare for our marriage. Chapter 1881. Ning Xuema widened her eyes. This was too fast. It was too smooth. Was she really dreaming? Was there a time when their marriage was so smooth? It was impossible, right? Ning Xuema suddenly thought of something. Oh right, we can't get married, right? Didn't they say that gods and devils can't love each other? Jili raised his eyebrows in surprise. Who said that gods and devils can't love each other? Why do you say that? Ning Xuema was also stunned. She blurted out, didn't they say that gods and devils can't coexist? If gods and devils love each other, they will go against heaven's law and bring disaster? Bring about the destruction of the world. Jili stretched his legs and rested his chin on his hand. He looked at her thoughtfully and said, where did this saying come from? Why didn't I know? Could it be that the Jili of this world didn't know about heaven's law? Then when did he know? Ning Shuima felt a little confused. She coughed. It said that this is heaven's prophecy. Maybe heaven's law hasn't made this prophecy yet, but it doesn't mean that it won't happen in the future. Jili glanced at the white stone not far away, and then looked at her in his arms. Heaven's law. No one knows it better than me. If it really had a prophecy, I would be the first to know. Now, I don't know, so how did you know? Ning Shuima choked. Jili looked at her with a deep gaze. Shuima, are you hiding something from me? If she told him that she was Shuima 50,000 years later, what would he think? What would he do? Ning Shuima made up her mind and looked at him. Jili, have you heard of time travel? Jili looked at her and shook his head slightly. Ning Shuima took another breath. Actually, I'm not the current Shuima. I'm 50,000 years from now. Before she could finish her sentence, she suddenly heard a heart-wrenching cry. Mother, don't leave Nianma behind. That cry was extremely sharp, like a heavy hammer striking her heart. There was a loud bang in her head and she felt dizzy. When she came back to her senses, she was surprised to find that she was floating in the air. She subconsciously looked down, but before she could see anything clearly, she heard another cry, Mother! Wow, Mother! Ning Shuima shuddered. The space in front of her suddenly twisted and spun like a kaleidoscope. Then, she felt her vision go black. Her body felt heavier than ever. Ning Shuima opened her eyes and saw the light blue bed curtain. Outside the bed curtains, a luminous pearl emitted a faint light. Her hand was tightly held by someone, and a small head was pressed against her hand, crying heartbreakingly, Mother, don't go! Mother, don't go! You can't abandon Nianma. Nianma will be good and obedient. You can't do this to me. Warm tears flowed down her hand. Ning Shuima's hand trembled, and she was completely awakened. Her lips moved. Nianma, the little head on her hand suddenly froze, and then he looked up in disbelief. The moment his eyes met hers, the child's eyes suddenly opened wide, and his voice trembled. Mother. His little face was streaked with tears and his eyes were swollen from crying. His big eyes looked like small eyes from crying. He plunged into her arms. The little child was only 2 feet tall. He pulled Ning Shuima's clothes and cried loudly, Mother, you scared me to death. Woo! Chapter 1882. Nianma plunged into Ning Shuima's arms. The little child was only 2 feet tall. He tugged at Ning Shuima's clothes and cried loudly, Mother, you scared me to death. At this time, he finally cried to express his grievances like a child who was only a few months old. Ning Shuima struggled to hold him. She felt that this body was very heavy, and many parts of her body were in pain. However, it was her body in this world that had just returned from Mother Earth and was severely injured. Amo, you are finally back. A voice was heard from above. The voice was vaguely familiar. Ning Shuima heard it and looked up. Her body was slightly stiff. A handsome and tall man in a purple robe was standing in front of her bed. He was waving a fan in his hand and looking at her with a smile. There were waves of light in his dark eyes. It seemed as if he was happy and teasing her at the same time. There was also an indescribable emotion in his eyes. His purple robe was extremely complicated and gorgeous. The light from the luminous pearl above his head shone on his purple robe, making it look as if there was water flowing on his purple robe. Dao Tianchen. No, it was Luo Juchen, the guy who drugged her 50,000 years ago. Thousands of thoughts flashed through Ning Shuima's mind, but she did not show it on her face. She even raised her eyebrows in surprise. Who are you? Her reaction was very fast. At this moment, she already knew where she was. She was back in the real world, and the person in front of her was the only person who existed 50,000 years ago. Perhaps he was also the person who knew the truth. If she asked directly, he would never tell her with his scheming mind. Therefore, she had to find a way to ask him. Her eyes were too pure, as if she had just woken up from a dream. It did not look like her soul had just returned. Luo Juchen looked at her and seemed to be trying to find something from her face. After a moment, he slowly smiled with a gentle smile. Imo, I am Dao Tianqian, and I am also the only honored lord in this world. You were severely injured and dying, and I saved you. Do you know that you almost died? He looked at the clock in the middle of the hall and sighed again. If you hadn't woken up in another 15 minutes, then I wouldn't have been able to do anything. Fortunately, you've come back and you're awake. The only honored lord? What kind of title was that? Ning Xuema was not interested in the other things he said, but she did not like these words. Her heart skipped a beat, and she had a bad premonition. What does the only venerable mean? Luo Juchen sat on a chair beside her bed and smiled. I am the only great lord in the 6 realms. He then glanced at little Nianma, who was staring at him in Ning Xuema's arms. I have agreed to one of the conditions of this little guy. One of the conditions is that he cannot be called a deity, so I call him Great Lord. Ning Xuema's face paled. Another god. After this world's Shunjili's soul was destroyed, another god appeared in this world. Mother Earth once said that gods and devils couldn't coexist, and gods and devils couldn't love each other either. If there were gods, there wouldn't be devils, and if there were devil masters, there wouldn't be gods anymore. If she wanted a god to be reborn, she, the devil master, had to die. When she came back from Mother Earth, she planned to leave this continent with little Nianma as soon as she recovered. As long as she was not on this continent, perhaps Shinjili could be reborn in 100 years. However, now another god had appeared. In this world, gods and devils couldn't coexist, but there couldn't be 2 gods, right? If Luo Juchen was really a god, did it mean that Shinjili would never come back? Chapter 1883. Ning Xuema felt that her hands and feet were cold. She looked at him for a moment and suddenly sneered. You are boasting too much. Do you think you are the master of heaven and earth just because you said so? You don't believe me? Luo Juchen stopped waving his fan. Only a fool would believe you. Ning Xuema was disdainful. Luo Juchen chuckled. His smile was absolutely beautiful and had a soul-stirring power. If he showed such a smile to other women, those women would be instantly killed. They would be obsessed with his smile, allowing him to do whatever he wanted and obeying him in every way. However, the mother and daughter in the hall were not interested in his smile. Shinyanma was the first to jump up. Now that his mother was back, he had more confidence. You are not the master of heaven and earth. My father is. Don't try to fool us. Luo Juchen's eyes showed a hint of a smile. Little Nianma, your father was indeed the master of heaven and earth. Unfortunately, he has... Luo Juchen. Before he could finish his sentence, Ning Xuema interrupted him. Although her voice was still a little weak, it was very powerful. Luo Juchen's pair of charming phoenix eyes narrowed slightly. He glanced at Ning Xuema's face. Imo, do you still remember me? She called out his real name as soon as they met. Did she still remember the things that happened 50,000 years ago? Rumor had it that she had lost her memory from 50,000 years ago. Ning Xuema did not say anything. She just closed her eyes slightly. You can go out. I am tired. Imo. Luo Juchen's eyes flashed slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. Ning Xuema did not open her eyes. Her voice was weak. Luo Juchen, I don't want to talk about the past now. I am tired. Let me rest. Her face was indeed very pale. It seemed that she would faint at any time. Luo Juchen paused and sighed softly. Have a good rest. I will come to see you tomorrow. Nianma was fast asleep. The child had been watching over her for 3 days without rest. He had cried for 3 days and finally fell asleep. She was sleeping in her arms, her small hands unconsciously clutching her clothes tightly, as if she was afraid that she would run away again. Even in his sleep, he was restless. From time to time, he would mutter, Mother, don't leave Nianma. The 3 days that she was in a coma must have traumatized the child. Ning Xuema gently placed her palm on her son's eyes. Although she was very tired, she still insisted on reducing the swelling in her son's eyes. She then pulled the child closer to her side, letting him lean closer to her. There were only the 2 of them left in this world. She was the child's pillar of support, so she couldn't willfully abandon him. She had just talked to her son and found out everything that had happened after she fainted. She knew that she had been dead for 3 days. She also knew that Luo Juchen was released from the bell by Nianma. She also knew that Luo Juchen had to agree to 3 conditions. 2 of the conditions had been fulfilled. Perhaps, after he had completed the 3 conditions, he would truly become a god and replace Shinjuli. When she thought of the last point, Ning Shuima broke out in a cold sweat. She would never allow such a thing to happen. Shinjuli was irreplaceable. She did not hope that Shinjuli would always be a god. But once Luo Juchen became a god, it meant that Shinjuli would never come back. Ning Shuima's senses were still very sharp. When Luo Juchen stood here just now, his aura was very strong. Chapter 1884. Ning Shuima's senses were still very sharp. When Luo Juchen stood here just now, the aura around him was very strong. It was almost as strong as Shinjuli's. Therefore, she could not completely deny this person's words. Now, this person was a huge threat. Both Ning Shuima and Nianma's injuries were minor, so they could not confront this person head-on. Therefore, Ning Shuima temporarily used a stalling tactic to send this person away first. Ning Shuima closed her eyes slightly and silently thought. Since Shinjuli immortalized and she came to Fantian Palace, many things had happened. She had to carefully think through it. However, there were too many clues, and they were like a mess in her mind. She could not sort them out at the moment. She raised her hand and rubbed her eyebrows. Her body was a little sore after lying down for a long time, so she gently turned over. However, this time she froze. The area between her legs was sore and numb, and it hurt a little. This symptom, it was clearly the symptom of just having sex. Could it be that she was raped by Luo Juchen when she was in a coma? No, it could not be. Little Nianma also said that he had not left her side for the past 3 days. No matter how bad Luo Juchen's character was, he could not have done such a dirty thing in front of a child, right? She thought of the dream again, and her heart suddenly moved. In the dream, she and Shinjuli had a few tender moments. She remembered that when she woke up, she had just been intimate with Shinjuli. Could the sex in the dream also make the body in the real world feel the same? Dream, was it really a dream? Little Nianma said that she felt like she was dead for the past 3 days. There was no sound, not even a heartbeat. It was clearly a symptom of her soul leaving her body. Was it not a dream? Was it just like when she ran to Yi Qinghuan's place? Did her soul travel through time and space to 50,000 years in the past? If it was time travel, then everything she encountered there was real. Shinjuli was real, and she had a relationship with him was real. The story of little Shuima was also real. And most importantly, what Mother Earth said about gods and devils not being able to love each other, gods and devils not being able to coexist, the so-called heavenly Tao was also false. Otherwise, with Shinjuli's intelligence, there was no way he wouldn't know. Where did this rule come from? Or perhaps there was no such rule at all. Mother Earth lied? But that woman clearly swore at that time, and it didn't seem like she was lying. Maybe after he recovered from his injuries, he would go and find Mother Earth again. Even if he had to force her, he would force her to tell him the truth about what happened 50,000 years ago. Strange, how did he travel back in time to 50,000 years in a row? And every time it was in this palace. Was there something special about this palace? 100 thoughts flashed through Ning Shuima's mind. She couldn't lie down anymore, so she simply put on her clothes and got out of bed. Her body was also very weak. She staggered when she got down, and the wounds on her body hurt faintly. She closed her eyes and rested for a while before starting to get busy in the hall. She used to be a special agent, and searching for things was her forte. As long as there was even the slightest abnormality in this hall, she would be able to find it. However, no, she did not find anything. The only thing she felt was that this hall was cooler than other places, and Shinjuli's aura was slightly heavier. Ning Shuima was actually a little absent-minded during the process of searching. It was too similar. The layout of this hall was too similar to what it was 50,000 years ago. Even the furniture had not been changed. The screen? the light blue bed curtain, and the vase painted with mandala flowers. Chapter 1885. The screen, the light blue bed curtains, and the vase with mandala flowers. Everything was so familiar. It was as if the 50,000 years were just a waste of time. There was no trace left in this hall at all. Even the quilt on the big bed was like the quilt in the past. The second time she had sex with Shinjuli was on this big bed. She felt as if there was boiling water in her heart. That time was just a dream to her. Who would have thought that there was a gap of 50,000 years in between? Now everything was there except for him. After all, she had just woken up after being dead for 3 days. Her body was still very tired, but she did not feel sleepy. She recalled the time travel journey again. At the last moment, she wanted to say that she came from 50,000 years in the future. However, her soul left her body and traveled back in time. Was it a coincidence? Or was it something that she could not say? She left just like that. Did her body faint or return to her 50,000 years in the past? Would Shinjili notice it? What would he do? Thousands of questions were hovering in her mind. She was having a headache from thinking too much. She simply covered herself with the quilt and went to sleep. Her eyes fell on the quilt again. She clearly remembered that she was lying in the same bed with Shinjuli until dawn. Now there were only her and little Nyenma in the quilt. There seemed to be a soft part of her heart that was suddenly hit by someone. The pain was unbearable. The saddest thing was that things had changed. She closed her eyes again. If she had a dream, would she travel back in time and see him again? With this beautiful fantasy in mind, she fell asleep in a daze. In fact, not only did she not dream of Shinjili that night, but she also did not dream of him for the next 4 or 5 days. It was drizzling. The pitter-patter of light rain weaved into a curtain of rain, making the world hazy. The sound of a flute came from afar and echoed in the drizzling night. Ning Shuima frowned slightly. These days, Luo Juchen had been playing the flute for half a day. To be honest, the sound of the flute was really good. His skill was comparable to that of the legendary Shaoshi, who could play the flute to attract phoenixes. Fortunately, no birds or beasts could enter the Fantion Palace by themselves. Otherwise, his flute music might have attracted a phoenix. Even if he couldn't attract a phoenix, he could at least attract a peacock. Ning Shuima felt that his flute sound was vaguely familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had heard it before. Her memory was amazing, and she had the memories of 3 lifetimes. However, in these 3 lifetimes, there was no memory of this flute. Then, when did she hear it? Couldn't be the prenatal music she heard in her mother's womb, right? Every time she heard this music, she felt a little irritated. Now, in this boundless rainy night, hearing his sorrowful flute music made her even more irritated. Little Nyenma was studying. He was also annoyed when he heard that. He covered his ears and complained, "Isn't this person annoying? You brag about it every day as if you're mourning." Ning Shuima touched his head. "Mother, let's go out and have a look." Little Nyenma pulled the corner of her clothes. "Mother, this person is an old fox. Don't be fooled by him." Ning Shuima chuckled and flicked his head. "Of course not. Who do you think your mother is? I will never be fooled by him." She turned and walked out. She also set up a soundproof wizardry barrier in the room to prevent the sound of the flute from disturbing her son. Chapter 1886. It was drizzling. In the small pavilion, Luo Juchen was leaning against the railing. The sound of the flute was long and lingering, as if it was telling the sorrow of parting. He stood there like this, looking like a fallen flower standing alone, and a pair of swallows flying in the rain. Ning Shuima did not appreciate it. She landed outside the pavilion and looked at him with her arms crossed. When the sound of the flute stopped, Luo Juchen's eyes were fixed on Ning Shuima. "Imo, is my flute sound good?" "It is very good. It is so noisy that Nyenma can't study hard." Ning Shuima laughed. "However, I would like to advise you. After all, you are only a guest in the Fantion Palace. It is not good for the guest to always disturb the host. Nianma and I do not like the sound of the flute. If you want to play it, you can go somewhere else. Luo Juchen looked at her. In the rainy night, his eyes were a little deep. Imo, don't you think that the sound of the flute is very familiar? You used to love listening to this flute. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. She had recovered the memory of the Devil Master, but it was still in the dream. She did not know what happened after that. Perhaps she could take this opportunity to ask more questions. Perhaps she could get some information. She smiled faintly. The past is not the present. People's preferences change. It has been too long, and too many things have happened. Forgive me for my poor memory. I can't remember some things clearly. By the way, when have I heard the sound of your flute? When you were a child. No, when you were still in the stone egg. Imo, you were actually hatched by me. Luo Juchen's eyes were bright. Damn it. It was really prenatal music. She raised her eyebrows and looked at him. Go on. Luo Juchen sighed softly. More than 50,000 years ago, I accidentally found a stone egg in the mountains and recognized it as a natural spiritual object. But at that time, you were targeted by a snake and almost fell into its stomach. It was I who saved you from the snake's mouth and placed you in a place with rich spiritual power to make it easier for you to hatch. At that time, I was afraid that you would be bored, so I played the flute by your side every day. Every time you heard it, you would let the eggshell light up to match my rhythm. You were very obedient. Later, I had to leave for a period of time, and when I came back, I couldn't find you anymore. He seemed to be immersed in ancient memories as he slowly recounted. Ning Xuema looked at him and didn't say anything. It turned out that she was indebted to this person for hatching her. But he had also plotted against her, causing her to almost lose her life. With this, they could be considered even. Amo, I fell in love with you at first sight. I've been looking for you all this time. He smiled at her again, his eyes full of affection. Love at first sight for an egg. Then his taste was really strange. This person was a smiling tiger. You would never be able to guess what he said was true and what he said was false. He smiled like a magnanimous immortal, but the things he did were completely different. These days, his gentle offensive towards her was very obvious. When she was bedridden, not only did he come to visit her every day and talk to her, but he also brought her all kinds of nutritional products and all kinds of rare fruits to nourish her body. In order to get information from him, Ning Xuema also tried to talk to him. However, this person was really an old fox. His words were watertight. Ning Xuema didn't get any valuable information from him after asking several times, so she was too lazy to deal with him. When Ning Xuema heard him say love at first sight, she smiled slightly. Your Excellency's words are a bit untrue. This is the first time I've heard of someone falling in love with an egg at first sight. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.